Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, the year was 1967. I was 9 years old. My sister Eloise was 8. We'd been orphaned after my parents had been tragically killed in an automobile accident. Now we were riding on a train with a young woman called Barbara by our side, who worked for the Good Samaritans. She was about 28 years old. She was accompanying us on a train journey to ensure we were received safely by our foster mother when we arrived in Charleston, West Virginia. I remember on this journey her eyes were watering. She would often be blowing her nose loudly in her handkerchief. She would look at us with sorrowful eyes. I remember thinking that she was a real crybaby, but now looking back, I realized the tears she was shedding were for us. The young woman was devastated that 2 young children, like a couple of abandoned fledglings, had been fortuitously flung from their parents' nest due to an unfortunate accident, and now we were embarking on a brand new life, without our parents, and we were in the charge of people who would stand in for them and would likely foster us for a short period of time, and then we would likely be passed on to another stand-in pair of parents, like a game of pass the parcel. At such a young age, everything was a hazy blur for me. I was confused and disorientated. My whole world had dramatically shifted, and the life me and Eloise had always known had come to an end, with exactly the same finality of my parents' car crash. Gone was the little apartment my parents rented in the Silk Stocking district of the Upper East Side of Manhattan, bounded by 96th Street to the north, the East River to the east, and Central Park and 5th Avenue to the west. Gone was my mother and her charming, bright, warm smile. Gone was the roller skating at Central Park, the Sunday trips with my father to the ice cream parlour, and all the other precious memories that came along with those early years, so much of which had now been expunged from my mind, with my memories now only a mysterious shadow. I only had a rather out-of-focus picture now left in my head of what my mother and father looked like back then, as those days seemed like a lifetime ago. I do remember being told by some kindly elderly woman, a social worker working for the Good Samaritans and liaising with the social services. She had a large mop of grey hair and wore these round, thick bottle-top glasses that made her look as if she had the most enormous eyes based on the reflection that would stare back at us. She informed me and my sister Eloise that our parents had decided to go on vacation to heaven. They weren't coming back any time soon. I remember being puzzled by this conversation, as my mother never liked to go anywhere without us, so the lady's strange comments made no sense to me at all. My mother had been a devoted mother, and was always worried about our whereabouts, so leaving us behind while she sauntered off to some exotic holiday destination seemed incongruously bizarre to me, and so out of character for my very unselfish mother. "Why is Mummy and Daddy not coming back?" I asked, looking at the old lady nonplussed. Your mummy and daddy like it so much where they are. They don't want to be coming back. It's very beautiful in heaven, you see. Once you visit the place, you never want to return. There's streets of gold there, fairy tale castles with large torrents, crystal blue oceans and clouds you can surf like the waves. When you get there, you can't leave. You're having so much fun, you see. My brow had furrowed with confusion. Well, why can't we go and be with them so that we can have lots of fun together and stay there forever and ever? My little sister had interceded. We want to go to heaven to be with them. We want to live in the fairy tale castle in the sky, and we want to ride all the fluffy clouds there. It's not that simple, the old woman told us. You can't go to heaven without a special ticket, but you mustn't worry, because one day you'll both get your own very special tickets to heaven when the time is perfectly right. Everybody gets a golden ticket at some point in their lives, but you have to wait your turn. It's very rude to jump the queue. My face brightened. You mean like a gold ticket, like Charlie in the chocolate factory, when he got a ticket in the chocolate bar? I asked excitedly. Exactly right. It's a very special ticket. Charlie was very lucky to get his golden ticket, which enabled him to go to the chocolate factory and meet Willy Wonka. Without the ticket, he would not have been given access to the chocolate factory, would he? So your mummy and daddy got their golden tickets. And like Charlie, who didn't want to leave the chocolate factory, they don't want to leave heaven. They're very happy there. One day when you get your golden ticket, you'll see them again. But right now you must both be very brave, because you're going to live in a foster home with another mummy and daddy, who'll be taking good care of you. But I don't want another mummy and daddy, I'd said. I like the ones we've got. The woman had frowned at me, becoming slightly exasperated. You're going to live with another mummy and daddy because your parents are in heaven. You need someone to take care of you when they're not around. They'd want someone to be watching over you, wouldn't they? Your parents don't need to be worrying about you. I was so bemused about everything, and very jealous that my parents had acquired golden tickets to heaven. I felt put out that me and my sister had not been so lucky. It wasn't fair. It was such a bummer. I loved the story of Charlie and the chocolate factory, and when I thought of my parents, I visualized them with large, gleaming golden tickets in their hands, huge smiles on their faces as they hung around a playground with a Ferris wheel, merry-go-rounds, roller coasters, pony rides, dancing dogs, magic shows, ice creams, toffee apples, and candy floss. How I wished I could be with them. Some people got all the luck. But why was it never me? Come to think of it, Eloise was also one of those unlucky people that never won anything on the fairground. It was always other kids that bagged the huge white fluffy teddy bear bigger than they were at the hula hoop stand, or guessed correctly about how many jelly beans were in the glass bottle. But me and Eloise always used to feel short-changed as we never won anything. We would return home rather beleaguered, our hearts heavy, with half-eaten toffee apples, very sore stomachs, sticky fingers, and caramel syrup trailing around the corners of our mouths. The 14-hour train journey was a very long 608-mile trip from New York to Charleston, Virginia. It was the very first time I'd been on a train before, so I was very excited, and I was mesmerized by the prepossessing, awe-inspiring scenery. I would watch the world go flashing by furiously from the window, passing meadows, fields, lakes, farmhouses, barns, woods, fields of cows and grazing horses, in between eating snacks, sleeping, and listening to the woman called Barbara reading us stories. When the train announced we'd arrived in Charleston, Virginia, and could disembark, Barbara helped us off the train with our 2 suitcases, which were all we had in the world, and looked a little worn out and tired, as both suitcases had belonged to my mother when she was a young girl. We were met at the station in Charleston by a formidable woman who scared me from the moment I saw her. She had that solemn, commanding voice and a no-nonsense manner that rather reminded me of a strict headmistress. She was wearing a very well-fitting tweed jacket that fit snugly around her narrow shoulders, a crisp white cotton blouse, a tailored skirt that fell below her knees, with a string of pearls around her neck, and a pair of very sensible hush-puppy brogues that were practical rather than elegant. Her face was slightly asymmetrical, her nose quite aristocratic, with a proud pointed tip. Her grey hair was pinned back in a neat bun. Everything about her was tight. Her manner seemed apathetic, as if she was picking up a couple of stray cats to take to the pound, of which she was not particularly bothered about. She had those hawk-like, beady brown eyes that seemed to stare at us. There was nothing warm in her demeanour, and she was not particularly engaging or very thankful to Barbara, who'd accompanied us on our trip from New York. It might have been nice if she'd actually thanked the woman for watching over us, but she did nothing of the kind. In truth, her obtrusive manner was rather abrupt and severe, her voice sharp and to the point. "So these are the children that I'm about to foster," she says in a haughty voice that sounded very matter-of-fact, as if she'd received a delivery from the baker's and was checking that she'd received the 2 apple pies she'd actually ordered. "That's right," said Barbara with a big smile. "This is young Stephen over here. He's 9 years old. This is his sister Eloise, who's 8. They've been very well behaved during the trip, you'll be glad to know. Given me no trouble at all." "Glad to hear it. I can't abide bad behaviour in children. I blame the parents if they misbehave. Children should always be seen and not heard. That's what my old mother always used to say." I could see the woman's cursory comments unsettled Barbara, who hadn't warmed to our foster mother any more than we had. Me and my sister Eloise were looking at each other tentatively, with a degree of trepidation, as we studied the very stiff-necked woman. Her hostile demeanour appeared to fit appropriately with her stony expression that she wore on her face. Barbara grimaced. She gingerly piped, "Could you please sign these papers for me, to affirm you received both children safely into your charge?" My foster mother visibly frowned. "For God's sake, woman," she snapped, "why does everything these days have to be bloody signed for? So much red tape. It's ridiculous. I told you I will take the children into my charge. Isn't that enough?" "It's procedure," piped Barbara, looking bashful. "It's the way the office handles the administration, I'm afraid. I'm sure you can fully appreciate we need to feel satisfied and thoroughly assured that both the children arrived safely in your hands." "Very well, then, I'll do it," she protested, "just to get those dreadful people out of my hair." The grey-haired woman frowns, snatched the paper and pen, and scribbled a signature on it, handing it back to Barbara, who folded it up neatly and placed it in her purse. "Before you go, I would appreciate some help getting those suitcases into the trunk of my car," she says. "But of course," said Barbara, her face puckered up with worry lines. I don't think she expected to receive such an icy-cold reception from the woman. Before long, our rather battered suitcases were flung into the trunk of a bright red Ford. "There you go," said Barbara. "I'll love you now and leave you. Have a really good trip. You've got quite a drive ahead of you, I'm sure." I noticed tears spilling down her cheeks. My, she really was a baby, I thought. I'd never seen anyone cry so much before. She grabbed us both impulsively, giving me and Eloise big hugs. "Look at me. I'm such an emotional wreck. I loathe goodbyes." "I'm sure she's not as bad as she looks," she whispered in my ear. "Be happy." Finally, she gave my cheek an affectionate tweak, and then she was gone, just like that. "Well, don't just stand there, children," said our new foster mother. "Get into the car, will you? We've got a journey ahead of us." I remember the journey in the truck was laborious. As for 2 children with low attention spans, being confined to a small truck for hours at a time after being cooped up in a train was exceedingly frustrating for us. But we politely bridled our tongues and did our best not to complain. We did stop off somewhere overnight and began the journey again the following day. My foster mother was driving to Wood County, that extends from the banks of the Ohio River down Interstate 77, which is a mountain corridor boasting magnificent rugged countryside and resplendent, head-turning, viridescent scenery. Our foster mother asked us to call her Mrs. Thimble, which is what we did. I remember laughing because my mother used to wear a thimble when she was sewing so that she didn't prick herself with a needle. It seemed rather amusing that someone should have the same surname as one of the gadgets that my mother had in her sewing box. "Something funny, Stephen?" she asked when she saw me chuckling, after she'd asked me to call her Mrs. Thimble. "You just got a funny surname, Mrs. Thimble," said Eloise, interceding. "A thimble is used on your finger when you sew to stop you from pricking your finger." Mrs. Thimble sounded unamused. "I'm well aware of what a thimble is, Eloise. I don't appreciate you making fun of my surname," she chided, her words stiff, her face indignant. A couple of days later, me and my sister Eloise had settled down into Mrs. Thimble's house in the countryside. It was situated on acres and acres of pristine verdant land. The house was swallowed up by the sprawling landscape like a piece of plankton in a whale's mouth. I couldn't believe that Mr. and Mrs. Thimble owned so much land. Me and my sister were from New York. We were used to space costing money, so I was absolutely certain Mr. and Mrs. Thimble must be millionaires. I mean, they had to be. They didn't have a 9-to-5 job either, like regular New York folk that bustled around the busy streets to get to work every day. Instead, the Thimbles seemed to bustle around the farmhouse, doing things all day at their leisure. I was to learn later it was because the couple were retired. Mrs. Thimble's late mother had left her well provided for, so they probably didn't need to work a day in their lives, as money was not in short supply for them. Mrs. Thimble loved the colour white, like no one I have ever known. I'm not sure why she was so devoted to the colour, as it was so impractical for a countryside home, and lent itself far better to a boutique-style apartment in New York, of which I had seen many. Mrs. Thimble's farmhouse was reasonably small. It was like a double-storey white wooden cottage with a white roof and a white wraparound porch that extended across the back of the house and provided an excellent entertainment area. There was a large outhouse and a barn that were almost as large as the house. Mr. Wallace Thimble was quite an unassuming, reticent, rather timorous man who barely said boo to a goose. But it was Mrs. Thimble that seemed to run the house. She was such an uncommunicative woman. You never knew what she was thinking, although she did know how to give you that look, whatever that look was. I did wonder why she'd chosen to foster children, for she had so little interest in us, and was always concerned we would bring dirt into her house, so we were expected to keep our shoes in the entrance hall at all times. The rooms in the house boasted white walls, white couches, white curtains, white furniture, white rugs, white cushions, and even a white fireplace. It was colourless, and although elegant to look at, the dominant obsessive white look was somewhat intimidating, especially for two young children like us, who thoroughly enjoyed wallowing in the dirt, getting our hands filthy, and climbing trees. Thankfully, the varying shades of white Mrs. Thimble incorporated in her decor boasted subtle contrasts. Luckily, our bedroom, that we shared together on the second floor, was painted in a pale green minty colour. I was relieved about that, because I didn't fancy doing my homework in an all-white room. It might well bleach my imagination and subdue my creativity. Indeed, it almost certainly would have driven me insane. I remember once hearing that prisoners locked up in an all-white room devoid of colour can go mad, and that doesn't surprise me at all. Colour is such a significant part of our lives, which makes the world a richer, more flamboyant place. Without it, everything is insipid, dull, and pale. Maybe Mrs. Thimble's obsession with the colour white was a reflection of the colourless state of her life at the time. I can't think of a better way to describe Mrs. Thimble than tight. There was nothing loose about the woman, the clothes she wore, nothing carefree, insouciant, or relaxed about her attitude towards things. It would seem under her inelastic, prudent charge and austere influences over our lives, which became rigidly structured and disciplined, almost as if she was like an army general that everybody had to salute. In truth, it was no different for her husband as it was for us. The seemingly emotionless, impassive woman never expressed her feelings. She never asked us about ourselves, or gave us any encouragement or love. If we asked her questions, she would immediately shut us down, usually with an answer like, "That's no business of yours, Stephen," or, "It's very rude to ask me such personal, impertinent questions, young man. It's not your place to do so." There were times it was awfully lonely in that farmhouse, and if I hadn't had my sister for company, I'd have been desperately unhappy. Mrs. Thimble homeschooled us, so our lives were relatively isolated, and in the beginning interacting with other kids our age just didn't happen. The only person that visited the house was the postman from time to time, and he used to give us these sympathetic looks, as I think everyone who crossed paths with Mrs. Thimble knew she was not exactly the most congenial woman. If she did speak to you, she could be as abrasive as sandpaper, and barely ever managed to smile. Mr. Thimble seemed to enjoy whiling away the long hours in the crisp, fresh country air, tending to his corn crop or his vegetable bed. The man had impressively green fingers. I remember some of his pumpkins were the size of a television set. He also loved to ride his black and bay horse Gusto in the countryside. He would abandon the house for hours at a time, only coming back in the early evenings. He'd settle down to enjoy a beer or two, read a detective novel, and not breathe a word to anyone. Truly, he was as quiet as a church mouse. When I asked him a question, he would usually say, "Yes, no, ask Mrs. Thimble." I think he wanted to keep his distance from the formidable Queen Bee, as much as we all did. The good news is that Mrs. Thimble was not adverse to us spending our afternoons playing in the countryside. On the contrary, she actively encouraged it, as she possibly enjoyed a reprieve from being away from us kids, where she could be left alone in peace to paint on her canvases in watercolours. It seemed uncanny that this woman who loved white so much enjoyed splashing around with colours on canvas, even though her work was rather wishy-washy and uninspiring at the best of times. I wouldn't describe that point of our lives as unhappy, because like any kids we were resilient. We accepted our lot, without considering whether it impacted on our happiness or not, as we lived in the moment and did not ponder over things in such depth. Which is possibly a good thing, as if you overthink things, it's likely to lead to depression of some kind. One day something extraordinary happened to me and my sister Eloise, that both she and I could not explain, that even for years after the event, and still all these years later, we say, "What the hell happened there?" Indeed, if I had experienced the event exclusively on my own, without the benefits of my sister's verification, I would begin to doubt that I'd experienced it at all. I would second-guess myself, convince myself it was all but a surreal dream. But I assure you, it happened. It was an event that would change our lives and our relationship with Mr. and Mrs. Thimble exponentially, but I hasten to say, in a very good way. Every afternoon, after devoting the morning to our studies, me and my sister Eloise gravitated towards the woodgrove like clockwork. It had become as routine to us as brushing our teeth. We loved playing by the rambunctious silvery stream that was so gracefully serenaded by a plethora of weeping willows that were like hunchback old men, hovering over the water's edge, with gnarled arms, dressed in long, elegant verdant sleeves that skimmed the surface of the reflectant water. This foamy white water friskily roared over the sculptural rocks, crashing spiritedly through the valley, and I always found the sound so incredibly soothing. There was an indestructible, sturdy white bridge that framed the stream, which meant you could trespass across the water without tripping awkwardly over rocks or getting soaked to the skin. We would sometimes play hopscotch there, marking the white wood with blue chalk. When we got to the woodgrove, we would scream and cry out at the top of our lungs to our heart's content and become kids again. It was like the woodgrove became to us our secret playground, the special, magical, enchanting place where we could let our hair down and feel free to be the spirited children that we were. As back at the farmhouse, we were always on our very best behaviour. I often secretly wondered whether when Mr. Thimble got away from Mrs. Thimble and was happily trotting down one of those quiet riding trails on the back of Gustorf, his fine-looking American quarter black and bay horse, and was out of earshot from his wife, did he suddenly whistle loudly, like a kettle releasing some pent-up steam? Indeed, I half suspected he did. It rather reminded me of the age-old saying, "When the cat's away, the mice begin to play," as if everything suddenly becomes alive when Mrs. Thimble isn't around, like a toy factory that once the owner has left the premises comes bounding back to life like magic. This particular day that would be so indelibly marked on our lives forever had auspiciously begun like any other. There was nothing in its essence or vibration that spoke of something remarkable being birthed. Breakfast was served as normal, promptly in the morning at 7:30 sharp. Me and my sister Eloise would eat oatmeal porridge every day, with blueberry jelly, at the white hardwood kitchen table, under the stiff gaze and scrutiny of Mrs. Thimble's beady eyes, who watched us judiciously as we consumed every mouthful. Mr. Thimble would sit at the table, almost as if he was 100 miles away, with his eyes carefully pinned in the newspaper, and a cup of coffee at his side, while he nibbled on a piece of toast buttered with marmalade. He was a thin man with a large bald patch in the centre of his scalp that was shinier than any of the polished furniture. His remaining hair was grey, but his steely grey eyes were difficult to see, as they were always buried behind a pair of thick-rimmed glasses. "Now you've eaten," said Mrs. Thimble, "go and wash your hands and brush your teeth, and we'll do some schoolwork in the study." "Yes, Miss Thimble," we'd both said dutifully. Mr. Thimble made some faint mutterings under his breath about how Gustav, his horse, was champing at the bit for some much-needed exercise. I don't think I've ever seen such a well-exercised horse in all my life, as Mr. Thimble could never get out of the house fast enough. I'd always see him leading his horse out of the stable block and finally trotting out into the country road. He'd be gone for ever and a day. I had noticed that the married couple slept in their own bedrooms, and there were no displays of affection between the two of them. I often wondered how the two ever came together in the first place, as they were like two passing ships in the night, docking at different ports every evening, with little in common, it would seem. In the beginning, me and my sister Eloise clandestinely pondered whether there was ever a point in their lives when the Thimbles may have actually been in love, but that seemed almost impossible to believe. If you had told me that they were distant cousins, I would have emphatically believed you, as their interactions together were at best limp, their conversations scant, guarded, impersonal, and terribly formal. It was only in the afternoon that me and my sister were free to go exploring, and as usual we made a happy beeline towards the woodgrove. I was delighted that the bleak midwinter was finally behind us, as it had been a bitterly cold one, with long gloomy days, overcast grey skies, and a plethora of snow. In a trice the cold days were confiscated by the audacious determination of a tenacious spring that had splashed her presence across the countryside, like the colour from an artist's palette. In a matter of weeks, the bleached stone-washed grass was renewing itself, with a fresh emerald-green covering. It was a beautiful spring morning. The soft ethereal shafts of afternoon sunlight bounded ebulliently through the forest canopy. The service berries, along with the red budwoods and the paulownia blooms, with their dazzlingly pretty purple chains of blossom, painted the woodgrove in a kaleidoscope of pearly colours. The woodgrove was a mixed tangle of deciduous trees, from oaks to sycamores, beech and chestnuts. Let's just say these lofty, imposing skyscrapers were as impressively large as they were tall. Me and my sister would tirelessly climb some of these towering giant warriors, and when you got to the top of the branches you could see the valley for miles around, and it was always a spectacular sight. Me and my sister just loved climbing those trees. On this particular morning the forest floor was littered with a plethora of vibrant patches of spring flowers. An ocean of blue flowers, namely violets and bluets, fringed the edges of the forest. The delicate butter-coloured pouches of the yellow lady slippers with their red markings laced themselves elegantly across the forest floor, intermingled with bleeding hearts, wild ginger, Dutchman breeches, and squirrel corn. They furnished the ground resplendently with their vibrancy, offering the ferns some much-needed cheerful companionship. I noticed there were plenty of undershoots at the base of the trees shooting through the ground. I knew the hard-working Mr. Thimble would soon clear them away, as the woodgrove had a disturbing propensity to become wild and untamed if it wasn't managed efficiently, but Mr. Thimble always kept the paths cleared. I noticed on this morning my nose was intoxicated by the powerful sweet scent of autumn olives that were quite overpowering in its dominant smell. It rather reminded me of times I'd stepped into the lift at Macy's in New York with my mother, and a very glamorous elderly woman had entered the lift, who had sprayed herself with half a bottle of strong perfume that made you feel like you were going to sneeze. The forest smelt like that, but it wasn't altogether unpleasant. We could hear the sounds of the nesting barred owls that made a sound that rings out like, "Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you?" along with the sound of the buzzing insects and the sweet twitters and tweets of the birds. Me and my sister ambled over casually towards the stream. I stopped dead in my tracks. I noticed that the sturdy white bridge that framed the fast-moving water was gone. It had completely disappeared. I knew where it was located, and the landmarks well, but the bridge, it was gone. It had completely disappeared. I knew where it was located, and the landmarks well, but the bridge, it was gone. "Where is the bridge?" asked my sister, looking perturbed. "How can it just disappear like that?" I looked at her nonplussed, not knowing how to answer her very good question, for I had no explanation as to where the bridge could have gone either. How could the bridge just vanish like that? We began to follow the stream in a downward trajectory, wondering if we might find the bridge somewhere along our journey. It had to be here somewhere, surely. A bridge didn't just disappear like this. It is substantial in size, and is not easily lost like a missing sneaker that can be buried underneath some forest scrub and might be difficult to locate. We were so confounded that neither of us spoke. We were trying to make sense of everything. We kicked up the forest scrub along the earthen path with our boots, both befuddled by this curious enigmatic mystery. If Mr. Thimble had intended to remove the bridge, surely he would have informed us about it. But someone had taken the bridge from its normal location. But who? We knew the woodgrove like the back of our hands. It extended for many miles, stretching out forever into an expanse of trees that sees no real beginning or end, as it marches on through the other farmlands. Me and my sister stopped dead in our tracks as we discover what I can only describe as a village of composed-looking houses in the woodgrove, standing about 80 feet away from the rushing water on a cobbled street, now overgrown with a thicket of weeds and long grasses. Me and my sister unequivocally knew that this long line of houses should not be here. We'd never seen them before. It is at this crucial point that I am convinced I've got to be dreaming. But there is no doubt that my sister is seeing exactly what I'm seeing. I have no idea what to think or what to make of any of this. At first we discovered the bridge gone, and now we find this mysterious street of lost, neglected houses in the woodgrove that should not exist. The houses were very old, standing up on crumbling foundations, with sagging grey slate roofs, peeling apricot paint, and decaying warped white window frames, and dusty windows caked in dust and grime, while the wooden porches were warped, buckled and rotten from years of erosion. You knew even before you walked over to the houses that this village of lost houses had long since been abandoned and forsaken, as ivy and creepers had hungrily snaked their way up and around the walls with a suffocating intensity. It was soulless, so quiet, you could have almost heard a pin drop. Me and my sister were driven by an insatiable curiosity, so we found a shallow part of the stream and navigated our way across some slippery stones until we finally crossed over to the other side. In a trice we began to curiously walk around the strange village, and it was the most peculiar experience of my entire life, which I shall never be able to forget. We trekked from one old abandoned house to another. The houses were very much the same on the inside, with exactly the same layout and floor planning. We were greeted to battered staircases, stained walls, rust and mould, shredded curtains, old decaying furniture, broken crockery. Everything was magnanimously covered in thick pillows of dust and huge silvery spider webs that seemed to trespass audaciously over walls and distorted ceilings. Some of the dinner tables in the kitchens looked like they displayed the unfortunate evidence of a last meal, but everything was dried up, the tables choked in dust. Mouse droppings and insect carcasses were everywhere. It felt as if the whole village was bathed in a lugubrious melancholia, without a single solitary soul in sight. It was the creepiest feeling in the entire world. It was when we began examining all the houses one by one that we suddenly got the overwhelming sense we were being watched. But when me and my sister glanced around, we couldn't see anyone standing there, but the uncomfortable feeling persisted. When we entered the last house in the street, we could not believe what we found. We discovered that the room was filled with human bones. There were skulls of different sizes perched on the top of wooden shelves, and human bones lined up in neat rows, like you might expect in an archaeologist's laboratory. Indeed, the bones looked ancient enough. It was when we'd entered this room I knew we needed to leave. There was something airy and unsettling about this place. Something dreadful had happened here. but I couldn't imagine what. My sister and I didn't speak. Our tongues were tied, our thoughts flustered, our minds jumbled with the horrors of what we were perceiving. It was almost like we were locked in a macabre dream, and were just walking around this bodeful abandoned secret village, nestled in the heart of the woods like a casual observer, just drinking in all the sights and sounds with a nonchalant indifference. In reality, the hopeless despair of this place burnt through bone, marrow and sinew, and we could taste the defeated sadness of everything. As we exited the last house, we saw her. There were no ways to describe her to you. She was like a wild, feral woman, wearing a long white robe, her face covered in dirt and grime. Her wild brown hair was tangled around her face like a bird's nest. Her filthy hands were like claws, and her behaviour like a deranged zombie. The moment she saw us, she started screaming and shrieking at the top of her lungs. The noise she made went right through me. Her bulging eyes were predatory, and me and my sister were absolutely terrified. We knew this woman was after our blood. She began to run after us with an old pickaxe in her hand, screaming like a banshee. I've never been more terrified as I was then. I was swallowed up by my fear. This woman was completely mad. She was like a lunatic, an unbridled wild animal, who was gnashing her teeth at us and thrashing this pickaxe around. "I'll kill you! I'll kill you! I'll kill you!" she screamed. Me and my sister rocketed as fast as we could through the wood grove, with her trailing in hot pursuit behind us in her bare feet. My heart thundered violently through my chest. My pulse raced. My breathing was so rapid. My adrenaline burnt through my body like acid. My legs were supercharged with energy. I just seemed to take off like a bullet. I have not run like that before or since. My sister seemed to have benefited from the same energy surge that gave us this distinct advantage over the woman. Soon we were far ahead of her. My sister tripped over a large log lying in the woods covered with moss. That was a great find. We discovered there was a sizable hollow underneath the trunk, so in our exhaustion we slipped under the tree trunk and hid. Soon we heard the woman. She ran past us, searching for us. I remember me and my sister held our breaths. We could sense the predatory woman in our midst. We knew she was exceedingly dangerous. At one time, the worst time of all, was when she was actually sitting on our tree trunk where we were hiding, to take a quick breather. We could hear her rapid breaths. Her hardened bare feet were only inches away from us. Indeed, we were so close to her, we could actually have touched her. I remember her snorting, and then mumbling about something. Then she walked away, her feet trudging noisily across the ground, sweeping past the underbrush. She kept talking to herself. Me and my sister were so terrified, far too frightened to move, so we stayed in our hiding place for ages. We would hold each other's hands, squeezing them tightly, but we never spoke, not even once. We were gripped with so much terror, a terror that we could not articulate into words. I did wonder if that feral woman had something to do with all the human bones in that village. Is that why the people of the village had vanished, and the village was devoid of any human life? I noticed in my hiding place that the pickaxe was covered with red stains, because it was so close to me I could see it, and I'm sure the stains must have been blood. Had she hacked all the residents to death? It was food for thought. We spent the whole night in the forest, far too scared to move, listening to the crickets and frogs, and at some point we both managed to get some sleep against all the odds. It was the following morning that I woke up with my sister beside me, gripped by an insatiable thirst, a gnawing hunger, and a desperate need to relieve myself. My sister looked pale, her eyes wide with fear. It was early in the morning, and the forest was filled with the buzzing sounds of the insects and the trilling of the birds' song. There was no sign of the woman anywhere. All of a sudden we heard someone whistling. The tune was so pretty and light-hearted. We knew that the wild woman would not be able to whistle like that. Nothing pretty could emanate from her. I didn't hesitate to scurry out of my hiding place, sure that maybe someone halfway normal was in the woodgrove who could lead us back to safety and help us to get out of here. To my amazement, me and my sister crawled out of our hiding place and were to discover that the person who was whistling was unlike any human being we'd ever had the pleasure to meet before. She was covered in long flowing dark hair, with an auburn hue, and was so massively huge. I would describe her as being like a lofty giant. She was wide in girth, towering at about 8.5 foot tall. I'm sure she weighed about 700 pounds, possibly more. She was so robust, solid, sturdy-looking, like a piece of solid furniture that would never ever break or crumble, powerfully built with dense muscles and strong legs. When she saw us, she stopped whistling and looked rather surprised. Indeed, she seemed befuddled. She physically scratched her head and gave us this astonished look that almost spoke to my mind with the words, "What are you two doing here?" I knew the moment my eyes met hers that I was perfectly safe and protected, and that the derailed woman from the deserted village could not hurt us while she had our backs. Everything about this idiosyncratic hairy lady was benevolent and very kind, but she had a charming outer-worldly quality about her, as if she had that kind of infinite knowledge and wisdom, understanding perhaps of the universe that most humans can't comprehend. "Can you help us?" I asked her, my feet trembling. I pointed towards the village. "There's a horrible lady there. She was trying to chase us with a pickaxe. Will you take us home so she can't hurt us?" I knew if the hairy lady guided us back to our farmhouse, we would be absolutely safe. The hairy lady spoke to my mind. Her words were crystal clear, concise, very articulate, as if you were speaking to me. She spoke to me and my sister in an ancient language we did not understand, that was miraculously translated into English in our heads. Amita Bunavali, Azi Kobushuna. How did the two of you get here? I found the question rather peculiar. "We walked through the woods." She shook her head. Ambutila Sinabo. I mean, how did you get here? She repeated, looking nonplussed. My sister piped. "Like my brother told you, we walked through the woods. But there wasn't a bridge anymore. The bridge vanished, and I've never seen those houses before." Ninoto Basika, Hisano Poli. This is no place for you, she responded. Hopokatita Sanafo. You better come with me. We followed the hairy woman. She guided us through the woods, and then we saw the white bridge again. My heart lifted. It was the most reassuring experience to see that bridge, as some kind of positive landmark, you could say. When we reached the edge of the woodgrove, the hairy lady said, Hopotasika, Hofono. Better go back home. They've been looking for you, I imagine. Me and my sister could not believe the wonderful reception we received when we got back to the white farmhouse. Mrs. Thimble, who we had always considered a cold fish, hurried towards us. Her formal, tight facade had gone. Her face burst into a jubilant smile, as the relief welled in her eyes and tears trailed down her cheeks. She grabbed us affectionately in her arms, hugging us tightly, as if she couldn't get close to us enough. And Mr. Thimble followed behind us, his eyes misting over with tears. "Where the hell have you been? You've been missing for 3 days and nights. We have had the police and searchers scanning the woodgrove for you, but we couldn't find you anywhere. Where did you go?" "We were in the woods," I explained. "We discovered the old village. The feral woman ran after us. We were so scared. She had a pickaxe." Mrs. Thimble looked at us with a bewildered expression. "There is no village in the woods. What are you talking about? You're not making any sense." Mr. Thimble was quiet for a moment. "You've seen it too," he said to us. "I was there once. I think it might be a glitch in our time or something." To cut a long story short, everything changed so dramatically in our lives after our 3-day disappearance. Mr. Thimble told us to tell the police we couldn't remember where we'd been. He told us they'd never believe our far-fetched story, even though he knew it was true. "I know what you told me is true. I've seen that village myself once." I think the fact that me and my sister had gone missing for 3 days had somehow brought down the cold veneer that Mrs. Thimble had worn for so long. Everything changed in our household. The Thimbles adopted us as their own children. The white furnishings were replaced with colour, as Mrs. Thimble could not bear the drab, colourless decor any more. She shifted from painting from watercolours to oils, using bright, flamboyant colours on her canvases. Mr. and Mrs. Thimble moved into the same bedroom together, and there was a twinkle in Mr. Thimble's eyes. He told us that it was thanks to us that he had got his wife back. "You shocked her out of her barren desert," he told me, "and brought that desolate wilderness back to life. I thought it would never ever happen. You have been like the rain." I was to learn that Mrs. Thimble had lost a 10-year-old child many years ago in a drowning accident, and had never been the same since, until we came along, and our disappearance jolted her out of her apathetic indifference, when she realized how fond she had become of us. In the years that followed, we had a very happy childhood, raised by 2 loving, devoted parents. Me and my sister were to discover that Mrs. Thimble was a passionate, colourful person, and over the years Mr. and Mrs. Thimble had an enviable relationship, as they became very much in love. It was only years later I was to discover the hairy lady I encountered was actually a Bigfoot. Needless to say, me and my sister searched for that lost village in the woodgrove, but we never ever found it again. Although over the years we'd hear the Bigfoot whistling in the woods, I'd recognise her tune anywhere, but we never physically saw her again. I think we must have entered some kind of time glitch or portal that day, but what happened I will never really know, and it is something I'll always ponder about. I once heard a scientist explain that the world is like an onion, with many, many layers and dimensions. This is my only explanation of what could have happened to us, but I promise you, this is a true story. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. It was a grim, cheerless day, clouded by a foggy, subdued greyness that choked the sky with a heavy cloud cover that looked unlikely to abate. The ominous weather spoke of a promise that was about to be unleashed, a threat that was hanging over the day with a suffocating certainty. A churlish, cantankerous storm was brewing on the horizon, and it hinted to the landscape that it would be there very soon. The trees listened to this clandestine warning, their boughs shaking with indignation, as a wind whispered through them, telling all who would listen to brace themselves for the coming wrath. If you were instinctive, you'd have picked up the stealth-like universal messages, as the indigenous animals most certainly had. The birds had wisely hearkened to the indelible signs and flown up to their safe canopy in the trees. Rabbits had returned to the secure confines of their burrows, and dogs persuaded their owners they needed to be brought indoors. Hamish sighed warily as he made his way to the cemetery. He hated coming to this desolate place. He parked his truck on what was once a pristine parking bay, but the red bricks had been terrorised and overtaken by the tenacious weeds and grass. The weather wore a disagreeable, uncooperative appearance, like a truculent teenager having a hissy fit, and Hamish hoped with all his heart that the dark clouds would calm down and finally fade away, but he doubted that this would be the case. The sorrowful church building that had once been an illustrious, prominent landmark in this part of the world, that so many people had regarded with pride, had made absolutely sure was well maintained over the years, was now begging for attention, crying out to be lifted out of its lugubrious melancholia, for it wore the heaviness of the cemetery around its foundations like a suffocating choker chain around a lady's neck. It seemed abandoned, lost, forgotten, forsaken, and desperately neglected, drowning in its interminable grief like a half-starved orphan kitten on the side of the road that everyone disregarded and overlooked. It was almost as if the church itself could not comprehend why it was no longer honoured and esteemed in this generation, as it had been in former bygone years, when everyone had treated the place with honour and respect, but not any more. Those glory days were long gone. The derelict church had not been used for a very long time. Its red brick seemed to have become stone-washed after years spent bleached by the sun. There was unforgiving trails of ivy, winding their way audaciously around the building, as if even the vegetation wanted to strangle the poor place into oblivion, steal away its very heart and soul, as if nobody cared a damn any more. Hamish felt exceedingly annoyed about the bleak condition of the old abandoned building that had been a prominent feature in the 1800s, where people had painstakingly placed magnificent huge flower arrangements at the pulpit of the church, while volunteers had polished all the wood and silver until it gleamed so brightly that you could see your reflection in everything, while the glorious stained glass windows twinkled at one time so brightly in the church, with their rich, vibrant, resplendent colours of the stained glass, displaying images of Christ that grabbed everyone's attention, but not any more. It was such a bleeding shame that such a phenomenal piece of American architecture from the 1800s had been so rudely unacclaimed, left to wallow in a deep cloud of depression. Hamish reluctantly climbed out of his gold Hyundai, finding himself unusually drawn towards the church, in a way he'd never been before, almost as if the church itself was beckoning to him, like an old friend. Maybe it sensed Hamish was one of few people that celebrated old neglected buildings like this, the unsung heroes of 1800s architecture. It was almost as if the stained glass windows, obscured by a plethora of dust, were pleading him to be rescued, for someone to be kind enough to wipe away their dust and polish them up again. He walked over to the church and pushed open the arched wooden door. It squeaked on its hinges, crying out in protestation, hungry for an oiling and a little tender loving care. As Hamish entered the church, he saw the sad little wooden pews lined up together in long rows on either side, heavily cloaked with silken webs, while a fine dust covered everything so thickly that you could have easily written your name in it. Hamish noticed that indeed someone had done just that, as on one of the pews was written the words, "Rob was here with Linda," that were scrolled in the dust. That was when Hamish's attention was drawn to something distinctly incongruous in the church that seemed out of place, even in this abandoned place of worship. It was the most massive nest on top of the podium, where sticks had been overlaid neatly in precise angles, covered with fine moss and animal pelts. It was like a monstrously huge bed that measured over 10 feet long and 5 feet wide, and surprisingly enough it looked rather comfortable, although the animal pelts smelt a little niffy. There was a large Coca-Cola bottle filled with water on the side of the bed, along with an unusual pile of interesting stones, some that were quite striking. Hamish bent down on his hands and knees to examine the stones in his hands. He'd never seen river stones like this before, filled with such flamboyant colours, from rich reds to greens, blues and purples. The sort of illustrious collection that would look good on a coffee table and certainly invite comment and interested speculation. Hamish wondered who would find river stones like this. He would have liked to have taken the stones away with him, but an inkling told him that they were not abandoned or forsaken, but part of someone's personal prize collection. What the hell, he thinks, feeling perturbed by what he's seeing, as the strange nest-like bed in a desolate, lonely church makes no sense at all. He was not sure what to make of all this. It looked like something was using the church during the winter months for shelter, but if that was the case, it didn't explain the animal pelts or the interesting collection of stones. In Hamish's discerning, judicious eyes, the nest looked like it had been made by someone very intelligent, a vagrant perhaps, who had made the bed in the church during the winter when it had been icy cold out there. He shrugged his shoulders, pleased to know that at least someone had found a use for the old church. As if there was anything that he loathed, it was waste of any kind. It didn't matter what the waste was. It could be not eating all the groceries you bought at the supermarket, or being forced to throw out leftovers, or an abandoned property that was benefiting no one. The old church fitted the latter criteria admirably, and if it had offered some poor soul shelter and comfort during the bleak, cruel winter they'd just had, it had been a place of God after all, even in its God-forsaken state, as it had offered someone refuge. Hamish's brown eyes glanced across the graveyard that extended back for many miles, where the tenacious weeds grew tallest around the stones of the most weathered graves, degraded by years of harsh, unkind exposure to the elements, eroded by moss and lichen, where the names of the faithfully departed had been abolished and worn away from the stones, almost as if they no longer existed. These were the graves from people who had died from a cholera outbreak in the 1820s, and the smaller graves spoke of little children who had not survived its devastating grip, which tugged grievously at Hamish's heart. He hated to think of little children dying so young, before they even begun to enjoy their lives, but he acknowledged to himself that back in the day, life was so much harder for many. The young man ambled over to the gravestones that stood stoically composed and silent. Even the vandals had showed no interest in disturbing this part of the graveyard, almost as if in some way the ancient cholera epidemic still left its imperishable impressions on the soil here. It might just be contagious from the lingering aftermath of such a devastating illness that had wiped out the lives of so many without discrimination. Who knew the strange things people could naturally presume? Maybe it was a good thing. It kept those kind of people away. Hamish was surprised to see that not even a lone cigarette butt or a sweet wrapper had trespassed over this area. He found that intriguing, as he found the graves that were old and neglected to be of the greatest curiosity of all, over and above the more modern introductions to a graveyard. "Who were you, little one?" says Hamish, stroking a little gravestone affectionately, as if it were the soft blonde curls of a young boy who needed some light encouragement. He warily walked away from the crooked old gravestones towards the trunk of his car, where he removed the wicker basket that contained all his essential supplies for the job he had in mind that needed doing as efficiently and as quickly as possible. Spritzer bottles containing harsh chemicals, paint remover, bristle brushes, scrapers, grass clippers, a trowel, glass cleaner, trash bags, gloves and wet wipes. Spring was on her merry way, and her ethereal, dainty, elegant hands on the landscape had indeed sparked the renewal of brand new life, most notably displayed in the show-stopping cherry blossom trees, crab apples and dogwoods, where their boughs were weighted down with a plethora of pretty blossoms. Indeed, the trees were like radiant flashes of beauty in this forsaken, shunned graveyard that seemed almost as desolate and lost as the old church building itself. The sequestered cemetery smelt of balsam, pitch, and the sweet-smelling blossoms of the butterfly bushes, bursting with purple blossom, intermingled with the delightful scent of crab-apple blooms. Hamish glanced up at the sky, almost begging for it to restrain its tears, as he could well do without the impending downpour that would easily threaten to hijack all his plans. He ambled through the cemetery, following the meandering gravel paths. The cemetery was situated in a rural area outside of New York. It was the anniversary of his mother's death 10 years on, when she had fortuitously been hit by a truck, driven by an unlicensed minor, at a zebra crossing outside the school that he had attended as a young boy. At that time, the graveyard had been better maintained. Not any more, though. In those days, weeds had been painstakingly removed from the grass. Hedges had been sheared and pruned. Someone had been overseeing the graveyard, keeping unwanted visitors at bay. But not any more. Things from thenceforth had gone steadily downhill at a rapid pace. Hamish needed to attend to his mother's grave before his sister and father arrived on the scene for their annual reunion to the gravesite, as they did every year like clockwork. When spring bobbed her head around the corner, Hamish always knew the gravesite yearly ritual was coming up. He did not want them to see what he knew he would find, what he always found year after year without fail. He didn't want to cause his father undue distress. But the vandals that visited the graveyard knew no respect for the dead. They left their indelible marks here, with unbridled foul words and nasty innuendos on the gravestones, as if they were desirous to torment the souls of the departed and disallow them to rest in peace. Hamish knew only too well who came here, most often young teenagers with a deep fascination for the occult, and then there were ghost hunters, and worst of all the vandals who came here to deface the gravestones, as getting their revenge on someone that could not fight back seemed expediently fruitful as far as they were concerned. Then there were the drug addicts and drunks, who often gravitated towards the graveyard for some inexplicable reason. Perhaps they found more solace in seeking the comfort of the dead than spending time in the presence of the living, who would be far too quick to judge them for their intoxicating indulgences that knew their scoffers no patience. The green colour of the grass, after the long savage winter and blistering snowfall, had been ruthlessly bleached, but it was fighting back tenaciously, as verdant shoots were audaciously plundering through the earth. But equally as forceful were the ugly weeds, determined to harness their graceless exhibits between the gravestones, while a jungle of creepers, climbers and unkept ivy snaked through the grass, like silent boa constrictors determined to throttle anything it touched. Hamish ambled through the graveyard towards his mother's gravestone, his heart heavy with the disappointment of what he saw. There were pentagrams, upside-down crosses, the number 666 scrawled across gravestones in angry red paint, defacing them with the menacing intentions that those symbols embodied. Worse still were the foul words scrawled across stones that seemed to be bad-mouthing the dead themselves, without regret or restraint. What on earth was wrong with this current generation? Hamish wondered. He had been a teenager himself not too long ago, although in truth it may as well have been another lifetime. He couldn't remember a time when he'd been so unquenchably rebellious as to behave like this. He knew he would not have been capable of plastering someone's place of rest with red paint and foul offensive words. It was nonsensical that people could have so little respect for those who had passed on. If you went back in history, you would see generations of people respecting the dead, going back to the days of the pharaohs, but not any more. Hamish agonized over this. As his eyes grew indignantly solemn, he noticed the black melted wax tangled between the grass, burnt incense, cigarette stubs, candy wrappers, drug paraphernalia, condoms, empty bottles and crushed cans. He fastidiously began cleaning around the gravestones, filling up his trash bags with all the nasty litter that carpeted the ground so offensively. He filled up 4 big trash bags, replacing them in the trunk of his car. He then returned to his mother's grave, appalled to see the provocatively objectionable writing all over the stone. Bitch was painted across her grave, along with a few more unmentionable bellicose words that left Hamish very discomposed. The young man found an anger coursing through his veins that seemed as volatile and as potentially explosive as the weather itself, but he turned his focus on removing all the nasty paint. Of course he knew that it was a rite of passage for many youngsters to dabble in witchcraft, to communicate with the dead, but this chaotic mess, this outright blatant disrespect for the dead, appalled him. These people needed to be stopped, he thought. Someone needs to stop them. He could count on his hand the number of times he'd been to the police station to talk about the blatant abuse of the graveyard here. But it seemed like the officers he spoke to were far more concerned with serious crimes on their beat than a few gravestones being decimated, which was low on their priority list. "We do patrol the area from time to time," he was told, "but it's not easy to catch these young louts getting up to their nonsensical mischief. Our hands are tied. There's not much we can do about this problem. We're dealing with an increased spate of burglaries on our watch, and graveyards are the last thing on our priority list. Maybe you should address this issue with the town council." Hamish knew that if the town council had not bothered to attend to the graveyard over the last 6 years, when the graveyard had become an eyesore, why would they do so now? Things were not likely to change in the foreseeable future. He began to tackle the weeds that played their part in vandalizing his mother's gravestone, as they weaved their way around the granite slab, showing no mercy. He pulled away the ivy that was clinging on to the edges of the stone. He worked quickly to clean around the stone and then spent ages chafing away the red paint. Finally he buffed the stone up with a polishing cloth and returned to his truck to wait for his father and sister to arrive. They should be here in any minute. He glanced at the time on his cell phone and then at the pewter-coloured sky. For a second he tried to negotiate with the weather to hold on a little bit longer. "Please," he begged internally, "please, let us just get on with the ceremony, and then you can come down in buckets if you like, but not until we've said our piece to our mother, like we do every year. Please don't ruin it for us." Soon his sister's white Honda Civic was now parking next to his truck on the overgrown red brick driveway of the old neglected church. He watched her slim silhouette climbing out of the car, hurrying over to the passenger side door to help her father out of the truck, which was always a laborious struggle. It would seem their father was old beyond his years. He groaned as he manoeuvred himself out of the truck very awkwardly, with his walking stick as his only means of stabilising support. After their mother's fortuitous death, Hamish's father had become like a parrot that picks and plucks at its own feathers due to stress and anxiety. Archibald Harrison had always been a little eccentric, but their mother Heather had understood her husband's quirky habits and peculiarities, and loved them all with an adoring admiration that he unequivocally knew he'd never find in another woman. Let's just say Archibald knew the love of his life, the mother of his 2 beloved children, Heather Harrison, could never ever be replaced. He could scour the kingdom 100 times over and never find another woman quite like her. And even if he could, he'd never want to replace her, as that would almost be treacherous in his opinion, and undermine the beauty of the unique love that they had shared together. The two of them had complemented each other, like salt's affinity with pepper, or maple syrup's relationship with soft, fluffy pancakes. Granted, he had known of men quick to replace their wives after their passing, as they couldn't bear the loneliness or seclusion of not sharing their lives with someone else. Yet for Archibald, he would rather live with his memories than an impostor posing as his second wife. No one could fill his wife's role. It would be like making a cheap replacement for Jif peanut butter. You just couldn't do it. The inferior, cheaper brands would be overshadowed by the original. Heather Harrison was the original in every regard that simply could not be substituted or replaced. Yes, it did get lonely. He wasn't ashamed to admit. The days could sometimes be long and dreary, with one nondescript mundane day folding into yet another. The memories of the past would rewind in his recall, like an old nostalgic record, playing wistful tunes, and they were the reasons he could get up in the morning to face yet another day. He was so glad of his happy memories, for they were his priceless precious treasures that could never be stolen from him, for they were safely buried in his heart, away from the prying eyes of thieves and vandals. Archibald's weathered face was overtaken by fine lines that made his face like an interesting road map of the world. His blue piercing eyes were lugubriously sorrowful, his body frail and emaciated. No one was more surprised than he was that he was still alive. He learnt it was common for one partner to die soon after the other, and he had accepted that that would ultimately happen to him. In truth, he didn't know why he was still here. He grimaced as he straightened his body out, leaning over to his walking stick to steady himself. For a brief moment he stared at the bedraggled church that looked so sorrowful in its neglect. He almost commiserated with the uncherished, disesteemed church building, whispering to it in his heart, "Don't worry, old fellow. I feel just like you look." He sighed heavily as he straightened his back and climbed out of the seat, wobbling unsteadily on his frail legs. How he loathed coming to this untended, time-worn graveyard, a habitude that the family honoured every single year. In truth, he never felt his wife was rarely there. Her body may be under the ground, but her spirit was long since departed. It would seem going through the motions with this family ritual year after year did bring a small satisfactory measure of comfort, even if it was very brief. Besides, it was significantly important for his wife, wherever she was, to know that she was never forgotten and was sorely missed by them all. Archibald did not have strong religious beliefs of any kind, but he had discerned a long time ago that there really would not be any point to anything if this life was all there was. He was sure that there was a bigger picture in the grand scheme of things. After his wife's unexpected death, he often had moments he could swear he was not alone, and could sense her loving presence. Then there was the curious matter of the occasional penny that would randomly appear on his wife's side of the bed, usually on her pillowcase, that he was sure was a sign from Heather, reminding him that she was still very much around and watching over him. "Are you all right, Dad?" Cordelia asks her father, removing the basket of white doves from the trunk, along with a big bouquet of white roses, which she threw over the top of the basket. "Look over there, Dad, it's Hamish," she says, pointing to the casual blonde-headed figure of her brother walking over towards them with a wide smile on his face and giving his father a big friendly pat on the back. "How you doing, Dad?" he asked. "As well as can be expected, son," said the old man. "And you, Cordelia?" he asks. She shrugs her shoulders. So. "Still having problems with that boyfriend of yours?" "I'm afraid so. He lounges around the apartment all day, not lifting a single finger. He hasn't even tried to find a job. I don't think he even wants to work. He enjoys being a kept man, spending all day watching Netflix. Normally I wouldn't mind if he pulled his weight around the place, kept our apartment in a halfway decent condition. But no, that's just too much to ask him. He doesn't lift a bloody finger. I return home to a dump. Dirty dishes piled high in the sink and the slob passed out on the sofa, snoring loudly, not doing a damn thing. Honestly, our bulldog Roly-Poly is more active than he is. And take it from me, that's really saying something. I'm the one that comes back home exhausted, and I have to clean and get dinner started after a hectic day at the office. Frankly, I had enough."
"It sounds like you need to draw a line in the sand," says Hamish. "If he doesn't change his lackadaisical ways, he should leave. Tell him he needs to go."
"It's easier said than done," says Claudia, sighing. "I still love him to death, you know. I'm a glutton for punishment. I know I am."
"Goodness gracious, girl! What would your mother say about all this?" says her father, looking appalled. "Your boyfriend treats you like this, and you're still in love with the man? There is no fool like an old fool, if you ask me. Here, let me help you, sis," says Hamish, taking the large basket of white doves out of his sister's hands to relieve her of her heavy load, while she removes the white roses and carries them with her. "Shall we go?" he asks. "I don't like the look of that leaden sky," says her father with concern. "The last thing we need to do is to be caught up in a storm. I'm afraid today it looks like we're going to need to hurry."
The three of them walk briskly through the grass. There's a cool wind blowing, but the Argentine ashen sky looks ominously dark, and you could almost smell the storm in the air. The white doves can sense the imposing threat. They're making a disgruntled flapping noise in their basket, as if they want to fly away home now, before the storm suddenly breaks. The grass sways in the wind as they move towards their mother's gravestone.
"Thank God the vandals haven't put graffiti over Heather's stone," says their father, sighing with relief, as if grateful for small mercies. "They seem to have messed up every other gravestone in the cemetery. But thankfully your mother's is undisturbed by some miraculous miracle."
Little did he know the half of it, thought Hamish to himself. Thank God he hadn't been here earlier. He'd have been very distressed.
"All right, who's going first?" says their father obsequiously. He looks at Hamish as if expecting him to take the lead. "Hi, Mum," he says. "We're all gathered around your gravestone to remember your life on the 10th anniversary of your death. It's as if you only died the other day. It's still raw to us now, as it was back then all those years ago. Especially for Father, especially for him. I can't believe you've been gone for 10 years already. I still get stopped in the street, you know, by people who used to be taught by you at the local school. Everyone remembers you very much, Mum, as a vibrant teacher that didn't suffer fools gladly. I hope wherever you are, you're well." He pauses for a brief moment. "Well, you know how I love going surfing at the beach not too far from here. Well, I met a remarkable surfer, as passionate about the sport as I am, last year. Possibly a few weeks after our last reunion. Well, he took me to surf the largest waves in the entire world that are 100 feet high in Portugal, in a place called Nazaré. And, Mum, I did it. Can you bloody believe it, Mum? I did it. I still keep playing the event over and over again in my mind. I've never had such a remarkable thrill like that before. There is no feeling like it in the entire world. Can you believe it? I surfed a 100-foot wave. It was the most exhilarating experience of my entire life. One wrong move, and I could have been thrashed to death by a wave like a concrete building coming down on top of me. But I figured, what's life if you don't live it to the fullest, Mum, and take the risks others may not be prepared to take. Many have lost their lives surfing at Nazaré, but like me, they deemed it a worthwhile risk to take. I know someone who broke his back from one of those waves, but he's recovering well and can't wait to get back on the wave again, despite coming so close to meeting his maker. Mum, you feel so small out there when you're riding a 100-foot wave that is so powerful, but it's the most exhilarating feeling in the entire world. I can't help wondering if you feel as free in heaven as I feel out there on the ocean. Surfers come to Nazaré from all around the world to attempt to ride these waves. Other than dreaming about my next surfing expedition in Portugal, Life's been pretty humdrum, but I think of you all the time, Mum. I miss you madly."
"Hi, Mum. It's me," says Cordelia, taking her cue. "I wish I could boast conquering a 100-foot wave like Hamish can, but I prefer to have my feet firmly on the ground. So Hamish makes my life seem insipidly dull by contrast. I think of you all the time as well. I miss you so much. There's a huge hole in our lives without you, even after 10 years. I'm still living with Barker Collins. I know if you were alive you'd be giving me a hard time about him, and you'd be right. Let's just say he's as lazy as ever, expecting me to pick up after him all the time. I want to kick him out of my apartment, but I just can't because I love him too much. It's like having a spoiled kid at home that I'm looking after, and although he's like a pampered pooch, I'm too attached to him to give him his marching orders. I know you'll think me a mug. I bought him a decent truck for his birthday. My girlfriends think I'm insane, and that Barker is taking advantage of my generosity, and they're right. They look at me as if I'm a complete idiot. As for the life of them, they don't know what I see in the man. He wants to marry me, but so would I want to marry me, if I had it as good as him. But I'm not prepared to make that commitment, unless he pulls up his socks. I may be many things, but unless he changes, marriage is not on the cards. Work is all right. I enjoy some of the challenges at the office, but other than that, everything is much of a much. Dad, it's your turn, says Cordelia, looking at her father tenderly. Last but definitely not least, Dad.
"Hello, sweetheart. It's hard to believe it's been 10 years. Where does the time get to? You would be proud of me, the things I do for myself these days. I went on a cookery course a month ago, so my food, I dare say, would even impress you. I wish you could try my corn chowder. It's quite delicious. I know you love corn chowder. And I make a mean pork shoulder as well. I'm still receiving the coins on the pillow. I know they're from you. Keep them coming, sweetheart. It makes me feel not quite so alone. I think of you all the time, sweetheart. Hundreds of times a day, in fact. But I don't need to tell you that. My heart aches with your absence, but when I'm hurting I remember the good times. We had so many of those, didn't we? I don't know what else to say, sweetheart, to you. But you have my heart. You always have and you always will. And for God's sake, don't go chatting up any other men at the pearly gates, because I'm watching you. You may be on the other side, but you're still my wife as far as I'm concerned, so don't you dare forget that. Goodbye, Mum, they say at once. Natalie walks over to the wicker basket and opens the clasp to release the white doves, who fly up into the air in flapping white ribbons, floating up into the cinereal clouds. They look magnificent, the sharpness of the white standing out prominently against the gunmetal sky. Cordelia dutifully places the white roses in a vase with water in it next to the grave. The timing is perfect, as all of a sudden all hell breaks loose. The thunder booms. The unforgiving sooty sky permits the lingering clouds to finally unleash their heavy, unforgiving loads of water onto the thirsty earth, while the jagged lightning strikes, whipping the sky angrily, and an unbridled charging wind that knows no restraint hurtles through the trees like one of the rambunctious waves Hamish so often surfs. It didn't hold back as it punnelled violently against their clothes. The towering statuesque trees in the graveyard begin to move vigorously, in time to the moaning, groaning, whooshing sounds of the jejune wind. Hamish, Cordelia and their elderly father tries to scurry through the desolate-looking graveyard, back to the truck as fast as they can. But they were not unscathed by the rain that pounded upon them in sheets. Finally they made it to their trucks in time, and parted company, bidding each other farewell. As Hamish drove down the asphalt road, now glistening from rain, his windscreen wipers were working zealously against its feisty assault. In the distance he could hear the drum rolls of thunder and see the jagged flashes of lightning bolting across the sky. He found his mind lingering to the ill-omened day his mother had so inauspiciously lost her life. He remembers it as if it was yesterday. He had been informed by the grief counsellor that her death would get easier with the passing of time. But had it really? It had been hard on them all. If his mother was still around, he knew his dad would be so much more ebullient and younger for his years. He probably wouldn't be even using a walking stick. His sister Cordelia would probably not put up with Barker, the layabout boyfriend of hers, and he might have not been so eager to thrill-seek out the world's most dangerous waves. It was almost as if after her death that the broken parts of themselves had not been fully mended, and probably never would. He wondered if a small part of him had a death wish. He had never been suicidal or depressed, but the grief of his mother's passing had not been something that had weathered well on his young heart. He could see himself at 15 years old again, standing on the edge of the pavement opposite the zebra crossing, walking behind his mother. It hadn't been easy attending the school where his mother worked as a school teacher, as some kids had given him a hard time about it. But for Hamish it was water off a duck's back. He didn't allow a few nasty jabs about his mother to get him down. The accident had happened due to a detention his mother had given a young 15-year-old boy in his year called Mick. He remembered his mother's words in class that day quite vividly. "I've had enough, Mick Fuller, of your inexcusable behaviour. You're going to be going home late this afternoon. You'll be serving a detention. You better let your parents know about this." The boy had stuck his tongue out at Hamish's mother and muttered something very disagreeable under his breath that sounded like a few cursory words. Little did Hamish know that a few days later no one would live to regret that Mick had got a detention more than he would. On the day in question, Hamish was about to cross the zebra crossing when his glove fell onto the ground, so he bent down to retrieve it. At that precise moment in time, Mick had inadvertently started up his mother's truck when he'd seen that annoying teacher, Heather Harrison, who had given him that damned detention a couple of days before, was about to cross the zebra crossing. "Perfect!" he muttered to himself. "Just perfect!" He dropped himself into the driver's seat of his mother's truck and started up the engine. He had grinned to himself, deciding that to give the teacher a nasty scare was a great idea. Next time she'd think twice before she dared give him a detention again. Mick, satisfied that his mother was obliviously catching up with a conversation with an old friend across the way, outside the school gate, and was otherwise busily engaged, so he could pull off the stunt without her knowledge. In a second, because that's all it takes, a second, he had driven his mother's truck forwards, but it had hit Mrs. Harrison harder than he had expected. The jerk was so powerful. He had only tended to brush against her, but things had gone horribly wrong. At first he'd been laughing. Then Mrs. Harrison had somersaulted into the air from the heavy push. She was flung off her feet. Mick's facial expression grew grave when he comprehended the gravity of what he'd just done. He had no understanding of just how powerful his mother's truck really was. People emerged from everywhere, like the bees from a hive, buzzing over the scene in a frantic frenzy. People were shouting, "Oh my God! Oh my God! Someone please call 911 now!" Hamish was to understand that Mick had not done this intentionally. He had realised that his friend was naively foolish and had only done this to teach his mother a lesson for daring to give him a detention after school. But the young man never expected things to get so out of hand. He was hoping the truck would give her a scare by nearly bumping into her, missing her by a hair's breadth. But he failed to master the manoeuvre and ran into Mrs. Harrison, launching her off her feet, where she was walloped up in the air like a soccer ball and came crashing down like a floppy rag doll onto the asphalt road. For a moment there was a soundless silence at the scene. Mick had climbed out of his mother's truck, his face as white as a sheet, wearing a palpable horror in his expression. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he kept saying over and over again. "I just wanted to give her a scare, that was all." Mick's mother had come charging towards him, her body language furious. She was swaying like a tree that was lingering on unstable roots. "What the hell have you done, son? What do you mean by driving my truck?" The young man began to howl like a lonely coyote, while the ambulance sirens blared in the distance until they came close. Hamish was one of the people that were lost for words. He was so stunned. He stood there like a lemon, staring in disbelief at the horrifying scene that was unfolding before his eyes, almost as if he was caught up in somebody else's horrifying nightmare that had no bearing on reality whatsoever and had absolutely nothing to do with him. But in a trice he realised it had. He rocketed over to his mother's side, where she lay unyielding. Hamish began shaking his mother's body as hard as he possibly could to try and wake her up from her slumber. But she did not respond. Tears poured down his face. "No! No! Mum, wake up! Mum, wake up! Wake up, Mum!" He looked up at Mick, who was still howling, standing at his mother's side. She was as white as a sheet. "Look what you've done, Mick! You've killed my mother! How could you?" "I'm sorry, Prue. I didn't mean to hurt her," Mick had sobbed. Mick's mother guided him away from the scene, where he was being questioned by a police officer. The EMT asked one of the bystanders to help Hamish. "He needs sugar. He's had a dreadful shock." Mr. Miller, the sportsmaster, had kindly ferried him off to a staff room, where he was given Coca-Cola to drink, and he had spoken to him in soothing words that had become like background noise to him. He hadn't heard a single one of them. The rest of the day was a haze to him, a whirlwind of events that was somehow extinguished from his memory. But one thing he did remember was the grief the inauspicious baleful event had brought upon his entire family. The senseless days that were to follow were colourless and bland, while the joys of his life had been ruthlessly expunged. And there was a time Hamish thought he'd never ever be happy again. Mick, the young man responsible for his mother's death, was charged with second-degree murder and a felony hit-and-run, but he was prosecuted as a minor. Hamish could understand a young man getting his revenge on a teacher with some silly supercilious prank, rather like placing a fart cushion on a chair, or crickets in her drawer. But this was going way too far, all because his mother gave the boy a detention. This was the kind of detention Mick was unlikely to ever forget. It would likely haunt him for the rest of his life. The young man had written to Hamish and his father apologising profusely for what he'd done. Hamish knew he meant every word, and felt an empathy for the younger man, having to live with this load on his conscience. But it didn't change the fact that his mother was gone, and there was no way to bring her back. If he was grateful for anything, it was that the coroner had assured his family that his mother would not have known a thing. She was out cold, and that knowledge brought him and his family a measure of reassurance, rather than having to watch their mother suffering, only to die later from the gravity of her injuries, which would only serve to postpone the inevitable. Sometimes a fast death could actually be kinder, but it didn't make it any easier. Hamish reflected over the state of his mother's gravestone, and how rudely it had been vandalised, with bright red paint and offensive words that he'd had to remove. Just thinking about it made his blood boil. How could people be so insensitive, so callous? He knew that red paint would be back again, as would the vandals. Surely there was a way of stopping them. Hamish then had a fabulous idea, and the good news was Hamish believed it might just actually work. The night of Hamish's plan. Hamish needed to arrive at the graveyard hours before anybody else did. The waifs and strays and the vagabonds, the drunks, the teenage enthusiasts, and last but not least the vandals that would meander here during the witching hours of the night to intercede with the spirits of the dead. Hamish knew he needed to park his car away from the nightly visitors' prying eyes, so he clandestinely chose a spot behind the old church, a clearing covered with so much grass that looked like no one had ambled over the area for years, as no telltale litter was found lying amidst the tall grass, and ugly weeds with obnoxious thorny tentacles devoid of any beauty could also be found towering through the brush like nature's cruelest eyesores, but remained undisturbed, which was a very good sign. This was a spot in the large graveyard, more forsaken and derelict than anywhere else, if that was at all possible. It would be the quintessential perfect hiding place where no one would know he'd camped down for the night, for he would be as ambiguously obscure as the furtively cunning coyotes in the woodgrove. Hamish flattened down some grass and pitched up a makeshift pop-up tent, along with everything else he was going to need for tonight's events. He had a very good feeling about all this and hoped that his plan might have some impact. He had to admit it was a magnificently beautiful day. It was mid-spring. The weather had been kind. The soft sunshine was filtering through the trees, almost as if the weather was conspiring to make everything go well for tonight's event. It was as if the graveyard, along with the old church, had had enough of the mean visitors who descended across the yard at night and were co-conspirators in helping Hamish achieve his goal. He had listened to the weather forecast that had promised fine weather for the next couple of days. The optimistic forecast made him feel even more upbeat. At the very least, it would mean that the evening would not be too fresh. But given what he was going to wear, he certainly wouldn't want it to be too hot either. He had been assured by the kindly lady at the costume shop that the costume was thermal regulated, but he doubted it very much, given how thick the fabric's hair was. He had to admit the costume looked remarkably realistic, and with the help of a dark night, to make things more foreboding and sinister, things could be very persuasive indeed. He knew there had been a plethora of Bigfoot sightings in these parts, and tonight he hoped to become the idiosyncratic creature himself. It was his aim to do his damnedest to scare the visitors to the cemetery so bad that they'd never ever come back to the graveyard again. But he knew he would need to make this an ongoing project for it to fully work. Once again, he decided to go and visit his mother's grave. He was here after all, so it was the right thing to do. He reluctantly ambled through the grass. His heart sank as he saw what he knew he would see. It would seem in only a few days the perfectly clean gravestone had been vandalized once again, as if it had been a blank canvas for a keen artist, but the words so callously thrust over the gravestone sent chills running down his spine. "She rides with the devil," followed by a skull and crossbones, along with the words bitch and 666. The white roses in the vase had died, while the gravesite looked a sorry sight indeed. Hamish could feel the bitter bile rising up at the back of his throat. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched as they punched the air aggressively. He could feel the infuriation consume him. "Sorry, Mum. You deserve to rest in peace," he said apologetically. "You probably wonder why I'm back at your gravestone so soon. I've had enough of these vandals trashing up your gravesite. Someone has to do something about this. The police have got their hands full, so I've thought up a plan. Wish me luck, Mum. I'm going to need it." He returned to his truck to collect the wicker basket containing the spritzer bottles and the paint remover, and fastidiously began removing the blazing red paint from his mother's gravestone and replacing the wilted white stones in the vase with some fresh ones he'd brought along. Once again he began to pick up all the trash from the last few days that was spread around the graveyard so pervasively. He found a Ouija board lying close to a large mausoleum that had been abandoned, and secretly hoped that whoever had been using it had somehow had a nasty scare. Growing up, he'd heard true stories about Ouija boards, one of which came from his own father's brother's mouth, and was closer to home than he would have liked. "Tell us what happened, Uncle Joey, when you used a Ouija board," Hamish had asked his uncle. His sister Cordelia had put her hands over her ears. "Don't tell me! I don't want to hear anything scary." "I'm not sure it's appropriate, son," said his uncle, glancing from his father to his mother, as if looking for their approval, as he wasn't sure that Hamish's young ears should be privy to such information. "I don't hide anything from my children," Joey, his father, had said. "I think it's wrong for parents to willfully hide things from their kids. My children need to understand the dangers of playing with such things. So tell them what happened to you." Hamish's mother had nodded. "I'm with my husband on this. My children need to know about the hazards of playing with these things that are beyond their understanding." "Well," says Uncle Joey, stroking his salt and pepper-coloured hair, "I was never the same after playing with that Ouija board, let me tell you. It rattled me like nothing else I've ever known. Needless to say, your father was far too sensible to play with one. He wanted nothing to do with it. I had actually bought the thing from a shop in town, and I thought playing with it would be great fun. I took the board over to the next-door neighbour's house. I was 15 years old at the time, and Mark Saunders was a year older than me. We were very good friends, and in truth we didn't really believe that you could speak to the dead, or that there were things called demons that could mess with your head. I remember I pulled out the game from the cellophane wrapper. It comes wrapped up just like any regular game would. I was trembling with excitement, but when we started to ask the board questions with our hands on the planchette, it moved on its own accord and answered our questions for us. We both thought that either one of us was manipulating the planchette, but suddenly the room became icy cold. It wasn't natural. There is no way to describe this to you, but we could feel a presence standing in our midst and breathing heavily. It was a warm summer's night, and this chill descended before us was unlike anything I have ever experienced. It was pervasive and immediate. You knew you were in the presence of a demonical entity. You just knew it, and worse still, you could feel it watching you, although you couldn't see anything. We immediately let go of the blanchet. We were trembling with terror, but the blanchet continued to move on its own accord. We screamed, and Mark Saunders' older sister, who was very religious at the time, came into the room, and this thing, on seeing her, let out a loud growl. She glanced at her brother's bed, her face paling with astonishment when she saw the Ouija board, and of course the blanchet moving on its own. She immediately started to pray, commanding the thing to leave at once. And suddenly this ugly mist, like a black smoke with a gargoyle-like face in it, was staring at us, growling fiercely, its eyes as red as fire. I felt as if I was looking at the devil himself. I've never ever seen anything so grotesquely evil, so incredibly ugly. Mark Saunders' sister screamed at the entity. It fled, and the icy coldness left the room at the same time. She picked up the board, glared at us and screamed, "Don't you ever do that again!" And of course we never did. Never been so scared in my entire life.
Hamish smiles as he remembers his uncle's story. He studies the costume he's planning to wear tonight. It had been made rather well. It was sufficiently well upholstered to make him look like he was an intimidating size, although he would remain under 6 foot, but there was not much he could do about that. He prepared himself for the evening ahead. He could not shake off the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced up at the dusty stained-glass windows of the church, and was sure he'd seen a movement, but it must have been a trick of the light, as when he looked up again, nothing was there. The witching hour. Hamish tried on his Bigfoot costume, wishing he had a long dress mirror to fully enjoy the whole effect, but he had a good feeling he looked the part. Now he hoped he could act like a Bigfoot convincingly. He'd been studying the behaviour of silverback gorillas on Animal Planet, and had tried to act out some of their movements. He thought his imitations of gorilla behaviour weren't too bad, although they could easily be improved. The last thing he wanted to do was to look like a man in a Bigfoot suit tonight. He needed to look like the real deal. The Bigfoot head of the costume was rather uncomfortable to wear, but if he needed to scare some of these youngsters away, he had to wear it. Even though the weather had been fine during the day, the temperature had dropped significantly, and there was a decided chill in the air. But covered in this thick costume, Hamish doubted he'd feel any cold. The whistling wind began to whip aggressively through the tall, lofty, statuesque trees that stood proudly on the periphery of the graveyard, like a long line of army generals guarding the cemetery. Their bony, convoluted arms and gnarled branches clawed outwards and upwards. They shook their new leaves wildly in the wind. The translucent light breathed life in the worn, faceless statues of praying children and winged angels, softening hard, broken edges, smoothing away fissures. Silence had engulfed the entire cemetery with a trepidatious sense of foreboding, while a dense fog wormed its way stubbornly through the graves. Hamish could see, perched on a tree branch, a bright pair of yellow eyes staring back at him. The owl straddled its feathery body onto one of the tombstones,
A little rodent emerged through the long grass, and the white feathery winged creature dived towards the little animal, lifting it up in its sharp talons, flying back to a branch with its hungry beak digging into its squirming meal. And after he had finished, satisfied, he remained on the branch, his large yellow eyes fixed on Hamish. He let out a lowly hoot. When the night finally struck the witching hour, the ambience of the graveyard shifted. The light from the moon became diminished, the gravestones sombre and subdued. Before long, voices and laughter could be heard as 6 teenagers intent on mischief, wearing hoodies and jeans, ambled through the graveyard, their drunken, incautious laughter ringing out loudly between the gravestones. Hamish surreptitiously slipped through the graveyard, ducking cautiously behind gravestones as he made his way towards the gathering of teenagers. 1 or 2 were sitting against the gravestones, using the headstones like the stiff backing of a chair. They gathered around in a tight circle, and Hamish realised to his horror that they were about to play with a Ouija board. He could hear the giggling voice of a young girl say, "We'll ask if there are any ghosts or ghoulies that haunt this graveyard." Hamish knew that this was his moment. He waited and listened. "Is anyone here?" came one of the voices. "What is your name?" "Oh, my word, it's spelling out the name Phelan. I saw a grave of a Phelan here the other day. Oh, my God, this is so cool. I told you it was much better to play with a board in the graveyard. This way you're closer to the dead, and they're more likely to interact with you," came the enthusiastic voice. "When did you die?" "It's saying 1948. That's super weird. That Phelan died in 1948. "Are you here with us?" came the voice again. This was Hamish's moment to strike while the iron was hot. He ran boldly towards the young teenagers, making a strange grunting sound, swinging his arms around violently. The teenagers screamed. They rose to their feet, hightailing it out of the cemetery, leaving behind the Ouija board and crying out, "Bigfoot! Bigfoot!" Hamish grinned, feeling fully satisfied that those kids would not be coming back to the graveyard any time soon. He could hear them hurrying to their truck and skyrocketing out of the graveyard at breakneck speed. He remained in hiding when he saw 3 male figures all wearing hoodies strolling towards the graves, and one of them had a familiar canister of paint in his hands. It didn't take the youngsters long to find his mother's grave had been cleaned up. "Brand new canvas," he said happily. "Haven't these people learnt that every gravestone needs to be marked with my paint? And the devil's signature, of course." He could hear the youngsters laugh, as if they thought what they were doing was hilariously funny. Hamish wondered if these unruly teenagers' parents had any idea what their kids got up to behind their backs. "What shall I spray on it now?" says the young man. The teenagers thought of something rude to say. "How about it stinks in here?" Everyone began to laugh. "That's cool," came another voice. "I like that." "Can I have a turn, Ethan, with the canister? You're always hogging it to yourself," came one voice, sounding distinctly put out. Hamish manoeuvred himself behind the cherry blossom tree, close to his mother's grave. He gathered a heap of pebbles in his hands to throw at the youngsters. He had in mind that he would clandestinely appear from the tree once they looked up. He'd show just enough of himself to give them a very big scare. They would be in no doubt that they'd seen a Bigfoot, but he'd be very unfriendly towards them. To his amazement, someone else is showering the kids with pebbles and doing a much better job than he is, almost as if he's acquired a willing accomplice. The teenagers looked startled. "Bloody hell! Someone is throwing stones at us," says one of the boys, looking around the cemetery for any sign of movement. But Hamish remained stoically still, and in the dark, gloomy shadows the kids can see nothing beyond the gnarled silhouettes of the trees. "Someone is watching us," says one of the boys. "I've got the creeps. Someone is bloody watching us. I'm telling you, I can feel it. We need to get the hell out of here." "It's just some kid having a laugh at our expense," says one of the boys. He raises his voice Stop it now, whoever you are. You'll be sorry. You hear me? You'll be sorry. If we catch you, I promise you, it's not just the tombstones that will be painted red. Just so you know, we know you're there. We're not intimidated. We're not scared of you. You hear me? We're not scared.
I think we should get out of here, came the whining voice that clearly didn't feel quite as confident as his cocky friends.
Something doesn't feel quite right. Oh, for goodness sake, Justin, are you going to continue being such a bloody baby? Maybe I should have left you home after all. Perhaps you should have stayed with Mummy and Daddy. When are you actually going to grow a pair?
Hamish throws more pebbles at the teenagers and lets out a growl that impresses even him. Not bad for a beginner, he thinks.
My God! Did you hear that? Came the terrified voice. I told you something is here. Something's watching us. I'm getting out of here now.
Hamish leapfrogs from his hiding place, charging towards the unsuspecting teenagers. He can hear ponderous feet running beside him, emulating his shrieks and growls, as if this is one terribly exciting game. The teenagers look up at Hamish in horror, but Hamish soon realizes that they're not actually looking at him, but something that's standing right next to him. Their faces are charged with terror. They turn around and run through the graveyard at breakneck speed. He can hear their truck starting up and see a container of red spray paint rolling across the grass. Hamish chuckles loudly, only to hear his chuckle being emulated. He looks up towards his accomplice, who's helped him shower the unsuspecting teenagers with pebbles. The night is so tenebrous, it's difficult to make out the figure clearly, but a soft shower of moonlight highlights the ambiguous being most favourably, so there's no doubt what he's seeing. He realises in horror that the figure standing near him is a genuine Bigfoot. He almost feels as if the universe is having a laugh at his expense. He never entertained the notion that Bigfoot could actually be real. Hamish's eyes almost pop out of his head, like the buttons from a teddy bear. He doesn't know how to react to this strange creature that appears remarkably benevolent. He removes his Bigfoot head to breathe in the fresh air. He feels suffocated by the thing. The Bigfoot emulates him, trying to pull his own head off, but he can't, as the Bigfoot's head is tightly fitted onto his gargantuan shoulders that would make an NFL quarterback's shoulders look almost puny and pathetic. Hamish begins to chuckle, as this idiosyncratic creature has a great sense of humour, and everything he does is terribly funny. The Bigfoot extends his hands towards the Bigfoot head that he'd been wearing, so Hamish hands it over to him. He is an absolutely terrifying creature to look at, but Hamish is not afraid, as the creature's friendliness towards him is tangible, and his eyes are filled with warmth and intrigue. His energy is convivial. The Bigfoot studies the fake Bigfoot head, and is chatting away excitedly as he studies it. Hamish can tell the Bigfoot is a young male, even though he's enormously big, with a strapping body that could easily weigh 800 pounds. By all accounts, Hamish had thought his Bigfoot costume was an authentic-looking costume, but next to a genuine Bigfoot, it looks like a cheap reproduction. The Bigfoot is so human, towering at about 9 foot tall, with a human-looking face, high cheekbones, a flat nose, and deep-set dark eyes that twinkle with merriment. The creature continues to chatter, backwards and forwards in a strange language. And on occasion, Hamish can hear the words, "That was fun! That was fun!" All of a sudden, Hamish can hear a very distinctive whistle coming from the trees. The Bigfoot's expression drops. The creature appears visibly disappointed. "Impota, ahakobo, amasivanulo, banasina." "I have to go," he says, in Hamish's head. "Ipoti, hapa, it's my mum." He hands Hamish the head, but Hamish returns it to him. "Keep it," he says. The creature's face brightens, and then Hamish watches it as it glides away, glancing over its shoulders at him. Hamish smiles to himself. "I thought I looked like a Bigfoot in that costume. What was I smoking? I must be imagining things.
I don't look at all like a Bigfoot.
Hamish was soon to realise that one night scaring a few teenagers away from a graveyard in the middle of the night was not going to stop it being vandalised. Some might be scared off, but there would always be other people who would visit the graveyard and repeat the same abusive cycle. Hamish had no regrets. He had encountered a real Bigfoot, and that was an experience not to be sneezed at. 2 weeks later, Hamish was at home flicking through the local paper. He smiled as he read the headline, "Could Bigfoot be scaring off people at local cemetery?" A group of young girls claimed to have been chased by 2 angry creatures in the dead of night after visiting local cemetery. "I know exactly what we saw," said Angela Hilinski. "I'll never ever visit that cemetery again. There's something out there that wanted our blood. They chased us out of the cemetery. We managed to escape by a hair's breadth. Personally, I believe I'm lucky to be alive. Who knows what these monstrous beasts would be capable of? There were 2 of them, one very small, with a primate-looking face, and another one built like King Kong, with a human-looking face. I've never been so terrified in all my life, and I, for one, will be staying away from that cemetery, and would advise others to follow my lead. I personally believe the government knows about these things, and let me tell you, they're out for blood. They're highly dangerous." The group of young teenagers exclaimed that they had visited the graveyard out of curiosity, wondering if they might have a ghostly encounter or something of the kind. "I always knew going to a graveyard would be great fun, but I never knew I would have an encounter with 2 terrifying Bigfoots." When Angela Hilinski's friends were asked to comment about their experience, they were very evasive and said they hadn't seen anything that night, and that Angela Hilinski was off her head and making things up. "They won't tell you what we saw," Angela insisted. "They're scared no one will believe them, so they won't admit it. But I've never been afraid to come forward and to speak the truth." Mrs. Hilinski is insistent her daughter saw 2 Bigfoot. "My Angela would never make up a story like this just to get attention. She knows what she saw that night, and I believe her implicitly. I think everyone should know that there may be 2 dangerous Bigfoot loitering around that graveyard." You decide. Did Angela Hilinski really see 2 Bigfoot in that cemetery? Or are her friends right when they claim she was as drunk as a skunk and seeing things in her head that weren't actually there? You decide. Hamish grinned when he thought that he'd pulled off the act of his life. He thought about the nest in the church and the strange selection of stones, and now he knew with certainty that it was Bigfoot who had found refuge in that long-since abandoned church, and it heartened his heart to know that the church was being put to good use. Still, it wouldn't hurt to have a word with the town council about getting that graveyard cleaned up and the church restored, and Hamish knew he would stop at nothing to fight for that building. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. Oh my word, it's a perfect day for a barbecue, said Mrs. Asher to her husband Luton. You're not wrong about that. The weather is fabulous. She smiles contentedly as she glances out of the sliding doors of her porch that overlook her backyard at her fabulous home in Seattle, where her family lived in a vibrant up-and-coming green leafy neighbourhood. The affluent detached houses in this neighbourhood were all individualistic and unique in their varying architectural designs, from more modern ranch-style homes to Queen Anne and Victorian style. They had one thing in common. Most boasted large yards and generous entertainment areas. The pavements were richly lined with towering mature oak trees, with sculptural branches that grabbed the skyline hungrily, wearing sleeves of bright green, verdant leaves. They magnanimously shaded your walks down the street, on sizzling hot summer days, like lofty, verdant umbrellas. Sonia Asher's house was a symmetrical, traditionally classic-looking building, with generous-sized windows and sky-blue shutters, along with a grey slate roof. The weather was smiling warmly down upon her on this beautiful Easter morning, assuring her that her confidence about the weather was spot on. The sky was a cornflower blue. A soft sunlight was peeking sneakily through the clouds, caressing the earth kindly with showers of ethereal light that lit up the trees and flowers so that the backyard twinkled. Mrs. Asher watched the tiny little birds sailing above her, carrying grass in their beaks, bustling towards the trees to build their nests industriously. It was spring. You could see its indelible marks on the landscape, almost as if an artist had brought out a grey canvas and splashed it with a sprinkling of vibrant colours. All the flower beds in the backyard were ablaze with yellows, whites, pinks and purple perennial flowers, and the crab-apple tree, dogwood and magnolia boasted tree branches that were littered gracefully with a plethora of delicate blooms. The two very mature oak trees in the far corner of the yard that seemed to guard it like two centurions on duty, only weeks before had been barren and naked, but were now swathed with bountiful green fresh leaves. Mrs. Asher watched her husband Luton, ardently preparing the barbecue for their guests. He was placing the coals into the barbecue oven and igniting the firelighters to get it going well in advance, before the Richardson family arrived for lunch 3 hours later. She could see the white smoke billowing from the charcoal coals. She knew her husband was a dab hand with the barbecue, and today he would serve up the best burgers, marinated spare rib and spicy chicken wings that her guests had ever tasted. The Asher family had known the Richardsons for over 5 years, having connected with them through their own children, who were the same age as their kids were. The Asher family had 2 children, Edwin 7 and Alice 6. Her husband was in his early 40s and worked in the corporate world, and for someone who didn't get much exercise, he was in remarkably good nick. He was a well-built man, who carried himself well and was easy on the eye. She had often noticed the children's nanny, Jocelyn, watching her husband with an appreciative look, which had somewhat unsettled her, especially after both of her best friends had warned her that having such an attractive young nanny around the house wasn't actually a good idea. "She's very pretty," said Mrs. Asher's friend Sophie, when she'd come over to lunch one Sunday afternoon. "I wouldn't be happy having her looking after my kids. I'm much more comfortable with an old, ugly nanny around, but not a head-turner like her. I mean, you hear stories, don't you, of nannies having affairs with their employers' husbands, and it's not pretty. Let's just say, your Luton, well, he's an attractive man, isn't he? And I'm not being funny, but your nanny keeps looking at him very inappropriately when she thinks nobody is watching her. But I've noticed. I keep seeing her smiling at your husband a little too much. That would worry me if I were wearing your shoes. I'm only saying." Mrs. Asher had been outraged at her friend's insinuations and felt affronted by them. It was like both of her very best girlfriends were implying that her husband Luton could easily be seduced by a young woman well over 20 years his junior. That was ridiculous. The man was old enough to be the young girl's father. Sonia Asher trusted her husband implicitly, and they had a solid, steadfast relationship. Why, only the other day he had described Jocelyn as a slightly confused teenager. "Poor girl," he'd said. "She can be a bit dithery, can't she, at the very best of times?" "Honestly," Sonia told her friend Sophie, raising a scathing brow, "you watch far too much Jerry Springer. You should get your mind out of the gutter." "I beg your pardon," snapped Sophie indignantly. This time it was her turn to look affronted. "I'll have you know, Sonia, I don't watch Jerry Springer, and my mind is never ever in the gutter." "Well, it sounds like you do watch Jerry Springer," chuckled Sonia. "The way you're going on. You sound as if you think my husband has the morals of an alley cat. My husband is loyal. He's a faithful man. And for your information, he'd never ever cheat on me. It's not in his nature." "How can you be so sure, Sonia? You're way too trusting for your own good. Things happen, you know." Sonia looked very uncomfortable to hear her very best friends talking disdainfully like this, with curled lips. They might personally feel insecure about their relationships with their husbands, but she and her husband Luton, they were unshakable. Not even wild horses could come between their secure marriage that was built on sturdy foundations and cemented by loyalty and trust.
A flirtatious nanny, who would not stop smiling at her husband, was not a remote botheration to her. It was sweet and innocent enough, charming even. The young woman had a harmless crush on her husband, but that was all it was. It was nothing to get your knickers in a twist about. A lot of young women admired older men. She had done so herself as a young girl, but it didn't mean she ever intended to do anything about it. It was, after all, a harmless, innocent infatuation, like one might have over a pop idol that you plastered all over your wall and admired from a distance. "Oh, look, don't be so reactive, Sonia. Honestly, look at you. You take things far too seriously," piped Sophie. "If you must know, I'm not really implying your husband Luton would cheat on you. It's not him I'm really worried about." She pulls in a deep breath, straightening her back like a pencil. She was clandestinely regretting having brought up this contentious topic in the first place, and was hurriedly looking for the exit door to talk about something else that wouldn't ruffle Sonia's feathers quite so much. Sophie loved her friend Sonia, hated upsetting her, but she couldn't help but feel that Sonia could be desperately naive at times. It would be judicious to warn her best friend about the nanny she'd hired, but at the same time she didn't want to cause offence. There was no middle ground here. You were damned if you did say anything, and damned if you didn't. She pauses for a moment, as if being mindful about what she's going to say next. Her kind brown eyes meet Sonia's. "I'm more disquieted about your nanny, if you must know. It's not really Luton that's the worry here. It's that girl. She's way too familiar with your husband. That's a cause of concern for me. She's very kittenish with him, provocative even. I mean, even the suggestive, immodest way she dresses I think is highly inappropriate. I mean, she's a nanny, for goodness sake. She shouldn't be dressing like that. She's showing way too much flesh with those salacious crop tops that she wears all the time. They're ridiculously short. If one of our children dressed like that, my husband would have kittens. I'm only saying." Sonia looked at her friend Chantelle, sitting on the opposite Adirondack chair, who was listening intently to the conversation, but not saying a single word. It was like her thin lips were clamped tightly shut, and her bashful brown eyes were avoiding any eye contact with Sonia, who was hoping her friend would come to her rescue and assure her that Sophie was talking through her backside, and she had nothing to worry about. But she didn't. "Don't look at me, Sonia," says Chantelle, throwing up her arms in exasperation. "I'm the last person you should talk to about stuff like this. I mean, look at me. I'm useless at human relationships, and I'm an incredibly poor judge of character. Hence the multitude of train smashes I've had in my life, with all my relationships with men. No, I never get it right. But I do agree with you, Sonia, that your husband is an incredibly trustworthy man. But I also have to agree with Sophie here, that you should watch that nanny of yours. She's what?" snapped Sonia like a crocodile, almost becoming defensive. She didn't like where the conversation was heading, and wanted nothing inexpedient to ungraciously or inconveniently upset the apple cart of her idyllic life, as words, suggestions, innuendos and negative thoughts like this could do so much damage, like a single cigarette causing a wildfire to erupt in a woodland area, causing chaos in its wake. No wonder they say we should guard our words with our life. "I don't know," says Chantelle. "I think sneaky would be the word I would use about your nanny. There's something I don't like about her, but I can't put a finger on it. I just wouldn't 100% trust her, that's all." Sonia had sighed heavily for a moment. Her fingers had trembled as she took a large sip of her Sauvignon Blanc. She appreciated the agreeable burn at the back of her throat, and the sweet woody nectar of the wine on her tongue. It anaesthetised the stunning sting of her friend's ominous words, that hung around her mind like a dusty piece of Christmas tinsel that needed to be brought down and discarded. She didn't want to be entertaining the thoughts her friends were inviting her to engage. "Look, I know you both mean so well, and I appreciate it, I really do. You're my best friends, the both of you, and I value your benignant advice. But you're barking up the wrong tree. Granted, Jocelyn is a little flirtatious and out there, but it's just her outgoing, uninhibited, gregarious personality. She means nothing by it. I trust my husband. Besides, my children love the bones of her. She's an exceptionally good nanny, you know. It's a struggle to find anyone halfway decent to work for you these days. I've been through 6 nannies, all unreliable and disappointing. But nannies like Jocelyn, they don't grow on trees. She's one of a kind, hard-working, very devoted to my children. She may be a bit ditzy and dithery at times, but I hit the jackpot hiring her. She's young and impressionable, but she's good with the kids, and great fun to have around. Yes, but you don't know anything about her, piped Sophie. I know enough. I've seen how she interacts with my children. I even spoke to her aunt. She looked after that woman's kids. The woman could only sing Jocelyn's praises. Yes, but what aunt is going to tell you that their niece has issues? Look, said Sonia, I don't know what the two of you are trying to say about my nanny, but I think we should both quit, or all quit, shall I say, while we're ahead. I'm just saying, Sonia. Watch her. That's all, said Sophie. And so it was, on this magnificently beautiful April day. The warning comments from Sonia's sagacious friends were far from her mind, and long since forgotten about, rather like a dandelion seed that had been blown away in the wind to settle on more fertile ground, where it ultimately could take root. She meandered over to the staircase to call for Jocelyn. "Could you give me a hand, Jocelyn, with some of the salads?" she called out. "Coming, Mrs. Asher," came the young woman's voice. "We'll be with you in a tick." Sonia happily watched her 2 spirited children racing around the yard zealously, looking for their Easter eggs that she and Jocelyn had carefully hidden in the underbrush, in flower beds, pots, in trees, and in all kinds of nooks and crannies at the crack of dawn, before the kids had actually woken up, and when the grass was glistening with morning dew. She smiled when she heard their whoops and screams of delight. "I got a chocolate bunny!" she could hear her son Edwin crying out with pleasure. Moments later, little Alice whooped happily. "I got a chocolate chicken!" They industriously carried their little wicker baskets in their tiny hands and bustled around the yard enthusiastically, their faces wearing thrilled expressions as they ebulliently searched for all the coloured eggs that they could find. Sonia, who didn't know how to exercise moderation or restraint, had been as usual overly generous and brought far too many chocolate eggs, a frivolous mistake she repeated year after year. But she thoroughly enjoyed hearing the delighted shrieks from her children. Like any mother, she adored making her children happy, and her heart would flutter like a pigeon's wings when they were this animated. She could only hope they'd eat lunch today, and not get sick from overindulging in too much chocolate. She had not learnt from the previous Easter, when both kids had gone to bed with telltale chocolate stains smudged around their mouths, complaining bitterly of sore stomachs, and not feeling particularly well. When Sonia had seen how many Easter egg-coloured papers were sprinkled magnanimously around the kids' room like confetti after a wedding, her heart had dropped. She wasn't surprised that both her kids felt rotten, if they'd eaten all those eggs. She decided that today she would try and encourage her kids to exercise moderation, if that were at all possible. But she was doubtful that her 2 energetic kids, who loved living in the moment, would know the meaning of the word restraint. Still, she'd try to make them see some sense. "What can I do?" said Jocelyn, entering the kitchen, giving Sonia a warm, breezy smile. She was wearing tight jeans that had fashionable long lines of rips along the knees. Sonia did not find her jeans to be at all attractive. I mean, who would want to wear jeans with rips in them, she had wondered. "It's the fashion, Mrs. Asher," Jocelyn had told her. "Everyone wears these ripped jeans. You buy them like that." Mrs. Asher had shrugged her shoulders in disbelief. "In my day, if I'd seen a young woman wearing jeans like that, I'd think she was so poor she couldn't afford to buy a decent pair." Jocelyn had laughed. "You're funny, Mrs. Asher. These jeans are super cool." This morning Jocelyn was wearing another one of her crop tops. This one was pink with lots of stringy tassels attached to it, and exposed way too much flesh as usual. Sonia grimaced inwardly. She didn't appreciate the way Jocelyn presented herself, but she knew better than to say anything about it. It was a free world after all. People could dress as they liked.
I was wondering, Jocelyn, if you'd help me make some salad dressing for the tuna salad. But of course, Mrs. Asher, says Jocelyn, flashing Sonia one of her big smiles. She walks over to the pantry to retrieve the olive oil and balsamic vinegar, and whips up a combination of oil and vinegar with mustard, honey and salt, and pours it over the tuna fish and chopped green salad. How many people are coming for the barbecue today, Mrs. Asher? It's just the Richardsons and us, said Sonia. They're bringing their 2 children along. Just as Sonia had anticipated, the day had gone swimmingly, where laughter and happy chatter had flooded the wraparound porch. Their little white dog, Tinkle, had bounced around the yard, barking at anything that moved, which had made all the adults laugh, as little Tinkle was now barking at a bush that was jiggling in the soft breeze, as if it was an undesirable visitor on the property that imposed a serious threat. That dog of yours is hilariously funny, Jean Richardson was saying. I can see he has no idea how tiny he is. I had a Pekingese like that growing up. He was a tiny dog called Crispin. He thought he was twice as big as any of the other dogs in the park. He genuinely had no idea he was small. He would charge every single large dog he could find, like Rottweilers and Irish wolfhounds. Crispin was confident and assertive and self-assured. He made the big dogs doubt themselves. They became intimidated by him. I remember he literally chased after this huge Doberman at the doggy park, and this massive dog was terrified. That's hilarious, laughed Sonia, taking a sip of her wine, while she could hear her husband chatting garrulously to Philip Richardson about golf and the last time he'd got a hole-in-one. The kids ran around the yard, playing all kinds of games together, which involved happy screams of delight and the occasional bout of tears, when one child complained she'd been pushed over by another. Mrs. Richards' 7-year-old daughter Bella came tottering up to the adults in her white tights and tiny tartan dress, with tears spilling down her chubby cheeks. Mummy, Edward pushed me over on purpose. I fell over, Mummy. Edwin, snapped Sonia, come here right now, young man. Edwin looked bashful. He trotted over to the table, his face avoiding Sonia's eyes, which told Sonia at once that her son was guilty as charged. Edwin, is this true? Did you push little Bella over? I want you to apologise right now, young man. Edwin hung his head in shame, as all the bemused adults watched him behind their glasses of white wine, their plates now stripped clean from the delicious sticky barbecue, with only the remnants of a cleaned-up corn cob left on most of the plates. Edwin looked up at his mother defiantly. She's a stupid little girl, Mummy. She doesn't like getting her hands dirty. She's a little sissy. I'm not a sissy, Mummy. I'm not a sissy, cries Bella. Edwin, piped Sonia, looking at her son with raised eyebrows. Are you going to apologise to Bella or not? Or do you want to go to your bedroom right now? Edwin looked shamefaced, his face flushing bright red. I'm sorry, Bella. You're sorry for what? Asked Sonia. I'm sorry for pushing you over, Bella, and for calling you a sissy. It was at the end of a long day, when the Richardsons had finally left the barbecue and gone back home. Sonia was now in the kitchen, washing up the long fluted wine glasses in soapy suds at her kitchen sink. She knew placing them in the dishwasher would not be wise, as the fine glass would likely break. All of a sudden Jocelyn came bounding into the room, her eyes now filling with tears. Sonia suppressed an inward sigh. She was exhausted after the screaming kids all day, and now she had a sobbing 20-year-old to contend with. This was all she needed, but she managed to restrain the inward frown from appearing outwardly on her face. She stopped drying up her glasses and rushed over to the troubled young woman, throwing her arms around her to give her a warm hug. What on earth is wrong, Jocelyn? Are you all right? I can't tell you, she splutters, the tears trailing down her cheeks, which she wipes away with her fingers. The young girl looks most troubled. Sonia had never seen her so distressed before. She was an easy-going young woman at the best of times. It was out of character for her to be this upset.
Now there, Jocelyn, you can tell me anything, you know you can. You live under my roof, and I consider you part of our family. Now what on earth is going on? She hands the young woman a tissue, guiding her to the granite island, where she pulls out a tall chair for the young lady. You sit down, Jocelyn. Blow your nose really hard, and I'll get you a nice glass of Mountain Dew. You need something sweet in your system. It always helps to have something sweet when you're upset. Jocelyn sits down on the tall chair, her pale skin covered in pink blotches, while trails of black mascara have left long dirt tide marks along her pretty little pixie face. Sonia reaches out with a tissue to help her clean it all up, and presents her with a large tumbler of crushed ice and Mountain Dew. The young woman takes a couple of sips appreciatively, blowing her nose loudly in a tissue, wiping away the remnants of her tears. There, that's so much better, says Sonia, looking at Jocelyn. Now tell me, what's going on? I don't know how to tell you this, Sonia, but it's your husband. He groped me. He wanted to kiss me, but I ran away, she says, the tears pouring down her face. I told him. I told him that I'm your nanny, that I work for you, and that he's married to you. But he said he couldn't get me out of his head, but he wanted to kiss me. For a moment, Sonia does not know how to react to Jocelyn's outburst. The young girl had claimed her husband Luton had groped her, tried to kiss her. This was insane. She knew her husband Luton wouldn't behave like this. But an anger that refused to give her husband the benefit of the doubt came thrashing through her mind like a bulldozing elephant, and Sonia became inflamed with fury. I'm so sorry, Jocelyn. I don't know what to say. Luton had no right to touch you like this so inappropriately. You're 20, for God's sake. He's twice your age. What the hell was he thinking? What are you going to do about it? Asked Jocelyn. Get the hell out of here, says Sonia. I need space from that husband of mine. If I look at him right now, I'd probably kill him. Where is he? He's in the yard, cleaning up the mess from the barbecue. I tell you what, Jocelyn, you and the kids get packed right now, do you understand me? We haven't got a moment to lose. I don't want to confront Luton about this, not now. I need to think, and we're going away for a few days. Where, Mrs. Asher? To my father's cabin in the mountains, of course. But what about your husband? Won't you think it's strange if you just bog off like this? I don't want him to know that you know about his advances towards me. I won't say anything, Jocelyn. But I'm quite sure he'll guess why we made this dramatic exit. He's not a fool. We'll leave him a note. I am so angry. I could kill him right now. I really could. I can't possibly speak to him now. He mustn't see us leave. Be quick about it and get little Tinkle and his dog food. You need to move as fast as a March hare before my husband comes into the house. Do you understand? Jocelyn nodded, her tears now taken over by the urgent need to get the children organised. Sonia and Jocelyn worked as fast as they could to get everything packed, while the two bemused kids were belted into the back of Sonia's truck. She left a message on the refrigerator in her kitchen which said, Dear Luton, gone away for a few days with Jocelyn, kids and Tinkle. Don't you dare get in touch. Need space and time to think. I know what you've done. I'm furious. Sonia. Mummy, where is Daddy? Why isn't Daddy with us? Asked little Edwin as the truck drove out of the twinkling bright lights of Seattle in the early evening, where there was only a sprinkling of trucks on the road, and things seemed reasonably quiet. But this was Easter, and people were possibly relaxing back at home. But as she travelled further on into the night, she noticed a lot more trucks on the road. He's not coming with us, sweetheart. He's got way too much work to do at the moment. We're going away for a few days, that's all. It's going to be fun, lots of fun, and you're going to see your grandfather. But where are we going, Mummy? Asked Edwin incredulously. You never said we were going away after Easter. We're going to Grandpa's cabin in the mountains. Now, isn't that going to be fun? You know how the two of you love that mountain cabin. Cool, said Edwin, sounding pleased.
I love Grandpa's cabin. It's the best cabin, but I wish Daddy could come with us. Why can't Daddy come with us? I told you, your father is too busy. He can't come. Sonia put some music on in her truck as a way of distraction. Although it was so modern, she had absolutely no idea what they were listening to. But Jocelyn appeared to be singing the words to the songs and beating her feet to the music, so it was hip enough for the young 20-year-old girl to appreciate. Sonia was heartily relieved that the young woman no longer looked distraught, but had resiliently bounced back to being happy-go-lucky again. That was a relief, she thought privately to herself. She could hear the light snores of her 2 children, draped with blankets in the back seat, with little Tinkle lying fast asleep on Edwin's lap. The poor dog was absolutely exhausted from barking all day at that bush, as indeed were her children, who had been running around the yard all day, engaging in numerous squabbles with the Richardsons' children, which was a good thing, as there was nothing worse than driving with 2 restless kids in the back, as well as a spirited dog. Jocelyn was scanning through Sonia's cell phone for her. "You've got 20 missed calls from Luton on your cell. Do you want me to delete them, or shall I read them out to you?" "Delete them," says Sonia, growling under her breath. "Right now. Luton is the last person I want to speak to in the entire world. When I'm upset, I need to get away from things, to think about stuff. I'm glad to say that Luton understands that about me. I'm so shocked, so appalled about what you've told me, Jocelyn. And I'm so dreadfully sorry that he groped you like that. I just don't know what to think. Nor do I know what to say. I'd never have believed in a million years that my husband was capable of that. Just shows what I know. I can't apologise enough for Luton's behaviour. I'm utterly ashamed. So ashamed. You are young enough to be his daughter, and he's behaved like a hormonal teenager. Truly, I thought my husband was much better than this. I really did. I'm clearly not as streetwise and savvy as I thought I was. Both my best girlfriends warned me that something like this could happen. But I didn't listen. Of course not. I just thought I could trust my husband implicitly. More fool me. I'm sure I'm not the first nanny that is being groped, Mrs. Asher, and I won't be the last, says Jocelyn, in a nonchalant tone, as if she was talking about the weather, or what they would eat for breakfast the following morning. Sonia didn't say anything. She felt almost as if she'd been thrown through the windscreen of her life and spat out on the grey asphalt road like a piece of chewed-up old tobacco. It was like every part of her entire body ached and moaned from the painful horror of her nanny's revelation that hit her so hard, like a cold hand being slapped across her face. Why would she doubt what Jocelyn had told her? The young woman would have no good reason to lie to her. She had always relied on Jocelyn as a nanny, and the young girl had never let her down. She had never known Jocelyn to be untruthful about things that really mattered. She knew the nanny was naturally flirtatious towards her husband, always flashing him bright warm smiles. But surely her husband had not been led on by her coquettish ways. He had even commented once that Jocelyn was very playful. I mean, that was Jocelyn for you. That was part of her personality, part of her quirky charm. I could kill him, were the words that circled around Sonia's head like a merry-go-round. I could bloody kill him, she growled. How dare he take advantage of a young innocent woman under our roof, the nanny of our children. It defies belief. Sonia began to doubt her husband's integrity as she drove along into the night. Did she actually know the man that she thought she had loved all these years? It would seem his actions over this weekend had shown her a side to her husband's character that Sonia found objectionable. I mean, how could she go on living with him after he'd groped the children's nanny under their own roof? The idea he was capable of such pubescent, loutish behaviour sent the bile flooding through the back of her throat, and a couple of times during the journey she had to pull over to the side of the road to violently throw up. Are you all right, Mrs. Asher? Asked Jocelyn, as Sonia pulled over to the side of the road for the second time. I'll be fine, said Sonia, her face as white as a ghost, her stomach churning like a washing machine. She hurriedly bounded over the guardrail towards the stoic silhouettes of some dark bushes and began to violently throw up the contents of her stomach. Her face began to sweat,
and the bitter bile that spewed up was repugnantly vile, but she felt better for the release. She composed herself, wiped the beads of perspiration away from her forehead, and staggered back to the car, wobbling somewhat awkwardly on her less than steady legs. She felt slightly dizzy, as if she'd been thrown around a roller coaster. The journey was not exactly a short one. It would be about an 8-hour, 45-minute drive from Seattle to Cascade, which was just over 500 miles. But they had left at 6, and if Sonia drove through the night, they could be at her grandfather's cabin past 3 o'clock in the morning, if they made good timing. Sonia was a proficient driver. She'd been the daughter of a trucker, and had often gone on long-haul truck trips with her dad as a little girl, and as a teenager had learnt to drive her father's truck, often in the wee early hours of the morning and late at night. She and her father had some great experiences in that truck of his. By all accounts, driving for 8 hours was a doddle, although tonight she was not on top form, with her emotions flying all over the place like the leaves around a leaf blower. Still, it was good to be able to focus on the road and not to think too much. Sonia's husband's face kept coming into her mind, like the proverbial boomerang. She could feel the anger coursing through her veins, like an unrelentless angry wave thrashing against the rocks, again and again and again. Sonia wondered what her husband was thinking back at their house in Seattle. Did he have any remorse for what he'd done? She hoped he was stewing in his own juices of shameful regret. Where did they go to from here, she wondered. She needed to talk to her father about this, as he would know what she should do. Sonia was very close to her father, who had a wise head on his broad, reassuring shoulders, and had always offered her the most sagacious advice. When Sonia was a little girl, her mother had dumped her off on her father, claiming she wasn't cut out to be a mother, and that had been that. Sonia didn't know who her mother was, and certainly had no desire in finding a woman who had about as much interest in knowing her daughter as Tinkle, her dog, would have in a bowl of salad. Sonia could not wait to see her father again. He'd get the surprise of his life, to see them fortuitously arrive at his cabin unannounced, but he would be thrilled to see them all. As they drove ever forward through the tenebrous night, Sonia noticed there were many more cars on the interstate at this late time than she would have anticipated. Maybe many people over the Easter holiday weekend were driving to the mountains for a break, and had thought driving at night would be a more efficient way to get there. It made perfect sense. Sonia certainly believed driving at night was a great idea, especially when you were carrying kids in the back of your truck. They were out of action at this time, and would not be tirelessly complaining of how bored they were, as they would be asleep for most of the journey, and that was a big plus. Jocelyn had drifted off to sleep in the passenger side seat. Her head began to flop against the window like a rag doll, banging against it gently, making a tapping sound, while a slight snore emanated from the back of her throat. She was definitely fast asleep. The weather had suddenly turned. If it was daytime, the clouds would have become as grey as gunmetal, but at night it was like the darkness was wearing another tenebrous coat, as a mist enveloped the black night in a foggy haze, blocking out the faint sliver of moonlight and obscuring all the stars. It would seem that all the scenery tonight had become so ambiguous. It was covered in sheets of darkness, like the inky black dust covers over your patio furniture, so you couldn't see a single thing. All of a sudden the heavens opened, and the audacious rain that knew no sense of moderation began to pelt down in a frenzied chaos, with the feistiness of a full-on garden hose. This is all I need, thought Sonia, leaning forward in her driver's seat, trying to see the road more clearly, as her windscreen wipers vigorously tried to wipe away the pounding rain. But it was a challenging thing to have to do. A tenacious fog continued to crawl across the road, hoovering up the moonlight, which meant that there was nothing to see at all, apart from her headlights that lit up the road. She knew she was driving in unfavourable, uncongenial weather, but Sonia had driven through far worse. She could get through this in the way she'd overcome all the other obstacles and challenges in her life. Sonia was a natural-born fighter, and wasn't easily intimidated or subdued. She had driven on roads covered in black ice many times before with her father, so this trip was a doddle by comparison. The vigorous interminable downpour was so loud, Sonia was remarkably surprised that no one in her truck was waking up from the noise it evoked, for the rain was not reticent, nor was it quiet. Everyone seemed locked in a very deep sleep. Several trucks had passed her speedily down this plunging mountainous descent, going so fast it seemed ridiculously short-sighted of them. "What is wrong with people?" thought Sonia. "Why would they drive past me so fast in precarious conditions like this?" The windy road that meandered down the mountain in sweeping curls had become a death trap, dangerous, slippery, exceedingly treacherous, and was easily inviting an accident to happen if you weren't paying close attention and taking extreme care and caution. She appreciated the unrelenting rainfall was not to be trifled with, that had made the road unstable and unsafe. Sonia sagaciously perceived she needed to drive with the skill of an advanced driver, but she maintained a safe speed, keeping her sharp, discerning eyes glued on the road, refusing to be distracted. She was wide awake now, paying extreme attention, as one wrong move, and she could be heading for great trouble. She didn't like driving on such hazardous roads like this, with all her children in the back of the truck, as this road rudely welcomed so many unexpected sharp turns, sheer edges, and awkward bends that dipped down the mountain. In truth, she had no comprehension of knowing what lay in front of her, especially when facing a dicey, unpredictable obstacle course like this, when most of her visibility had been snatched up by the hostile demands of an uncooperative night and the unmerciful weather that looked unlikely to ever abate. This was all right for one of those online video games, but this was real life, and this road presented a great challenge, even in good weather. She gritted her teeth and held on to the steering wheel so tight that the whites of her knuckles began to show. She could hear her father's encouraging voice in her head saying, "No big deal, Sonia. You know you can do this. You've got it, girl." For a moment the rain pelted down, and then out of the ethereal curtain of mist a haunting silhouette appeared in front of the road. "What the hell is that?" thought Sonia, peering forwards in her spattered windscreen to get a better view. "What the hell is that?" She pressed down her brakes forcefully as her truck came to a grinding halt. Suffice to say, if she hadn't stopped in time, she could easily have driven into this huge ambiguous figure. But she couldn't make out who or what it was. It was so indeterminate. She wasn't sure what she'd just seen. Sonia reluctantly opened the door of her truck to see what was going on. She reached towards her dashboard to retrieve a torch and climbed out of her truck, moving towards the strange cryptic figure, shrouded by mist. "Hello," she calls out. "Is anybody there?" She flickers her torch onto the large figure standing there and does a double take. She can't believe what she's actually seeing. The creature that obscured her path was in fact a Bigfoot. There was no doubt about that in her mind. It seemed to squint under the protuberant light of her torch, clearly not appreciating its impertinent glare. Sonia realizes it has got to be over 8 foot tall and about 700 pounds, with very large shoulders, covered in long dark black hair that is soaked to the skin. Sonia had heard about Bigfoots before, even listened to documentaries about them, and heard that they might live in the forests of Washington state. She did remember her father telling her he'd encountered a Bigfoot before on one of his long-distance truck trips on which she was in attendance, but she had never got to see the creature. In this close-up encounter with the illustrious creature known as Bigfoot, let's just say this bizarre experience was more than a little overwhelming for Sonia. Her stomach was churning, her heart pounding violently in her chest, as beads of perspiration broke out between her shoulder blades and trickled down her back, along with the rain. For a moment Sonia was terrified. She remained glued to the spot, her legs feeling like cement blocks beneath her, her mouth opened so wide in the sheer wonder of this unlikely event that seemed so surreal. Suffice to say, in this ponderous creature's presence, she suddenly felt quite tiny. The Bigfoot was powerful, lofty, majestic, built as robustly as an army tank. Yet despite the Bigfoot's intimidating size and his powerfully masculine energy, there was a benevolence about him which invited a calmness to wash over her, tranquilizing her frayed nerves and reassuring her primal instincts, which would likely have told her to run away as fast as her legs could possibly carry her. Sonia was surprised by how human the creature appeared. His face was handsome, in a rather rugged way, with a very powerful masculine jawline, chiselled cheekbones, a prominent forehead, a flat aquatic nose, and leathery grey skin. For a second the creature's deep-set dark eyes held her gaze. It spoke to her in a language that Sonia had never ever heard before, but it was translated almost immediately into her head. Opati, hipota bogoba, imbasipofona, hosafi. It pointed down the curvaceous bend of the mountainous road. Very bad accident down there, he said. Lots of cars. You keep yourself safe. Imata pisa, homo pikaka. The creature turned around and glided away gracefully down the hilly embankment and was gone from Sonia's sight. Sonia stood in the middle of the road, flabbergasted by the strange encounter. She was oblivious to the rain that was beating down in her body in sheets. Did that really happen? Did that really happen? She pondered. She heard 2 other trucks stopping behind her truck. A man with an umbrella got out of his truck, hurrying towards Sonia, with a frown on his face. "What's going on here?" he asked. "Why are you blocking the road?" Sonia, who was now soaked to the skin, looked up at the man incredulously. "We had to stop," she said. "There's a dreadful accident further down the mountain road. Lots of cars, I believe. I think it might be a pile-up." The man looked bewildered. He opened and closed his mouth, unable to say anything. Moments later they heard the sound of ambulance sirens and police vehicles hurrying towards them. "Bloody hell, I think you're right," said the man. "Something's happened. How did you bloody know? Are you psychic or something?" Sonia nodded. "Something like that," she said, knowing that the truth would sound incongruously bizarre and fictitious, but she knew what had just happened was real, and the revelation whipped inside her with a spirited excitement, like an unbridled wind sweeping up over the Atlantic. "I guess I should be thanking you, love, rather than giving you a hard time. We better get back into our trucks out of the way for the ambulance to get past. I can't believe there's so many trucks on the road tonight. Never seen it so busy before. I'm driving to the mountains with my family. I thought driving at night would be a great idea, but this road is treacherous, and I can't see a bloody thing. You're soaking, love. You better get back to your truck. It's raining cats and dogs out here. Some people tonight are driving like complete idiots." Sonia really was drenched to the skin. Her clothes clung to her like wet rags. She looked like she'd dived into her swimming pool with all her clothes on, but she didn't care. She suddenly felt deliriously happy as she climbed back into her seat next to Jocelyn, who was now wide awake after she'd heard the sounds of the ambulances, and even her children had their noses pressed to their windows, wondering what was going on, while Tinkle began to yap at the rain. "What the hell is going on?" asked Jocelyn. "Why are there ambulances and police? Has there been an accident?" "Yes, I think so. Some kind of accident down there on the mountain road." They were to discover that there had been a multiple pile-up further down the mountainous road, as she had expected, where 3 people had lost their lives so tragically, and 7 had been rushed to hospital. The trucks that had gathered behind Sonia had all come over to her to thank her for stopping. Little did they know that it wasn't Sonia that they needed to thank, but a Bigfoot. Jocelyn had stared at Sonia with a bemused look on her face as she tried to make sense about what had happened. "I don't get it. I mean, how did you know that you needed to stop?" Sonia looked at Jocelyn with a broad smile on her face. "It might have just been an angelic intervention, that's all," she said. Sonia knew that the Bigfoot she'd encountered had certainly saved her family's life, or at least prevented them from being severely injured or caught up in a multiple pile-up. Before they resumed their journey, Jocelyn went to the trunk to retrieve a towel from her suitcase for Sonia. "Use this! You're drenched to the skin!" "Thanks," said Sonia, grabbing the towel and drying herself down. Then they proceeded along their way, as a policeman with a flag was guiding the trucks past the pile-up on the road by waving them around a very narrow corner, where there was just enough space to get by. Sonia had refused to look at the carnage. It made her stomach churn as she saw the buckled cars in the road that looked like they'd been crushed at the knacker's yard. It was hard to believe that anyone had got out of any of those cars alive. "That could have been us," she whispered to herself. The rain had stopped. There were policemen bustling around the area. The people that had been involved in the accident had possibly all been ferried to hospital, but Sonia could smell the coppery scent of blood in the air and see pools of it in the asphalt road. She shuddered in horror. Jocelyn could only be heard saying, "My God! My God! We could have been caught up in that! We could be dead, Mrs. Asher, if you hadn't stopped! I'm so glad you stopped!" "Don't think about it," said Sonia kindly, reaching out to squeeze Jocelyn's knee. "We're alive and well. Isn't that what matters?" When Sonia did arrive at the cabin, her anger towards her husband had dissipated, and so had the sheets of rain that had stopped for quite a while. All she could think about was how lucky she was to be alive and well, and her children all in one piece. She also considered the Bigfoot she'd encountered, and she couldn't wait to share the extraordinary account of that evening with her father. She wanted to tell him about the incredulous Bigfoot she had seen walking out of the mist in front of her truck. He had told her he'd encountered a Bigfoot while driving his long-haul truck. She had forgotten all about it. Now she wanted to be reminded about the event all over again. She knew what had happened tonight was incredibly special, and felt so privileged to have met the elusive, idiosyncratic creature called Bigfoot. It must have been 4:30 in the morning when they arrived at her father's cabin, an hour and a half later than she had planned, due to the unfortunate delays, thanks to the pile-up on the road. Both her children were still fast asleep in the back. They'd only woken up briefly when they'd heard the ambulance sirens blaring past them. But when the riveting drama had waned and receded, and their curiosity had died down, they'd both fallen back to sleep. Sonia's truck had wobbled precariously down the rocky, uneven road, through the sprawling countryside, towards her father's cabin, but they still remained fast asleep. It remained dark. There was no more rain, and the foggy mist had evaporated, so the moonlight that brushed against the countryside illuminated the path clearly. So when Sonia parked her truck outside the cabin, her father must have heard her approach. His cabin door flung open. She could see him in his blue dressing gown, dashing towards the truck, with a large smile on his face. He looked bewildered, but extremely pleased to see them, as if he couldn't quite understand what Sonia was doing at his cabin so early in the morning. But he guessed she had a good reason for being there, and doubtless he would hear about it very soon. Sonia could feel the tears welling up in her eyes, as she hastily bounded towards her father, throwing her arms around him happily. She sobbed into his shoulders, saturating his dressing gown with her warm tears. For a moment, Sonia and her father were locked in a firm embrace. He patted her back gently. "Whatever it is, sweetheart, I'm sure it's going to be all right. You know it always is." Sonia adored her father more than anybody else in the entire world. He was her rock. He ruffled his hand through her slightly damp hair affectionately. "Whatever is the matter, sweetheart, I want to hear all about it." "Everything's the matter, Dad. Everything." "Well, let's get the kids tucked up into bed, shall we? And then you can tell me all about it. First of all, I might suggest you change your clothes. You feel rather damp." The children grumbled and moaned as Jocelyn guided them out of the truck, directing them to their bedrooms in the cabin. She then found herself a bed in one of the spare rooms and told Sonia she was going to sleep. "See you in the morning, Mrs. Asher. Have a good night's sleep," she whispered. Sonia's father, whose nickname was Elk, was a big stocky man,
with large shoulders and a masculine jawline. When he had been a long-haul truck driver, he'd carried an excess amount of weight around his middle. But after he retired and became more active, his body had become lean and strong. Her father's face was weathered from having sat behind the steering wheel of his truck for many years, having been cruelly exposed to the grueling effects of way too much ultraviolet light that is not exactly kind to the skin. She watched her father prepare hot chocolate over his gas hob and bringing her over a warm mug. As he sat down opposite her, "Well, what is all this about?" he asked her, putting down a hot cup of cocoa in front of her, which she sipped gratefully, appreciating the warm liquid gliding down her throat and lining her now empty stomach. "Dad, I don't know where to start." "Try the very beginning, sweetheart. That's always the best place as far as I'm concerned."
"Well, me and Luton, we had the Richardsons over for a barbecue today. They're good friends of ours whom we met through our own children. It was such a lovely day, Dad. Everything couldn't have gone better. The weather was fantastic. The food was delicious. Jocelyn helped me prepare salads. She's very good with the children as well. She was amazing with them all. Once the Richardsons had left, she came into the kitchen sobbing. She told me that Luton had groped her and tried to kiss her." The tears spilled down Sonia's cheeks like a deluge of raindrops. Her sympathetic father hands her a tissue, which she accepts gratefully. "Thanks, Dad. I just don't understand why Luton would do this to me, to us, to our marriage, to our children. Why would he throw everything away just for a quick thumble with our nanny? It makes no sense to me at all. And Jocelyn is so young, Dad. She's only 20 years old." Elk looks at his daughter nonplussed. His forehead furrows into hundreds of puzzle lines.
"Usually when something doesn't make sense, it's because it's not true. I don't understand. Luton is not a womanizer. It's out of his character for him to behave like this. I've known your husband for many years before you even married him. Are you sure, sweetheart, you haven't got your wires crossed somewhere down the line? I mean, with the greatest of respect, that nanny of yours is barely past being a teenager. What is a 40-year-old man going to have in common with a teeny bopper like her? The girl is just 20, as you were saying." "Well, what do you mean, Dad?" "Well, did you speak to Luton about this?" "How could I? I was furious. I got my children together and I came here at once." "You mean you didn't even have it out with Luton? Ask him what the hell was going on? Why he would grope the nanny?"
Sonia looked at her father through her bleary tears. "Well, what exactly are you saying, Dad?"
"I'm not being funny, sweetheart, but you seem to be pointing an accusatory finger at Luton without hearing his side of the story. Now that's hardly fair if you ask me. You're immediately assuming what the nanny has told you is true. How do you know she's not making it all up? Young people can get over-emotional, you know, take things out of context or exaggerate."
"Well, why would she make up something like this? I can't see why she would do that."
Elk sighs. "Well, something's not adding up here. As I keep telling you, I've known your husband for years. I also know teenagers well enough. They aren't always reliable. Maybe Luton said something to her. She made those allegations up to get her back on him. Luton loves the bones of you. He wouldn't jeopardize his relationship with you, for goodness sake, over a nanny in your employ. In the morning you need to phone him, sort this all out, find out what's really going on here. I think you'll find you're barking up the wrong tree."
Sonia realizes what her father is saying is making perfect sense. She needs to give Luton the benefit of the doubt, rather than just jumping to conclusions. He had never once lied to her about anything. Why would he start now? "Dad, there's one more thing I need to tell you."
"Yes? What is it?"
says her father, raising a brow. "We nearly had a bad accident tonight. Well, at least I think we nearly did."
"What?"
said her father, his face growing ashen with concern.
"What the hell happened?"
There was a multiple pile-up down a mountainous descent. You couldn't see anything, Dad. It was dark. The road was slippery. Everything was blanketed by a thick, foggy mist. And worse still, it was bucketing down so fiercely with rain that my windscreen wipers were struggling to wash it away. I was amazed the amount of trucks driving on the road over the Easter weekend. It was busy. I think people had decided to tackle the long journey to the mountains at night, to enjoy an extended Easter break. Everyone seemed to have the same idea in mind. I thought the roads would be empty, but I couldn't have been more wrong. I've never known it this busy in the late hours. Anyway, some trucks went whizzing past me at an audacious speed in the abysmal weather. I knew that wasn't a good sign. Dad, I don't understand why some people drive like lunatics in bad weather, especially when visibility is poor. I don't know what possesses them. It's like asking for trouble, like climbing into a tiger's den when the tiger is hungry, or swimming with piranhas with a big bleeding gash on your arm. It's just as silly. All of a sudden, in this pouring rain, I stop my truck because I see this huge silhouette standing in the middle of the road, Dad, moving through this curtain of mist. I climbed out of my truck. I wanted to see what was going on. I had to stop. Elk looks at his daughter as if she's lost leave of her senses.
You got out of your truck,
he says, his jaw tightening.
Because you see a huge figure standing in the mist?
Yes, I did. There was no moonlight. Everything was obscure. I couldn't see what this thing was. It was a Bigfoot, Dad. He spoke to me. He actually spoke to me. I'm not kidding. But not in your normal, conventional way as you would expect. In my head. It was telepathic communication. He was scary at first because he was so huge. In the beginning, I was rather frightened. In truth, Dad, I felt like an ant next to him. But he was so kind to me. I can't explain his eyes to you. They were almost angelic. Anyway, when he spoke to me in my head, he told me there'd been an accident further down the road with lots and lots of cars. He told me to keep safe, and then he was gone. I knew that what he told me was true. He seemed all-knowing, very wise. You know what I mean? Almost like he was an angel sent from God himself.
Well, he may well have saved your life, I have to say, Sonia. By the sounds of things, you could have ended up being part of that dreadful pile-up. Goodness gracious, what a relief you're all safe and well.
Dad, remember you told me you encountered a Bigfoot once on one of your long-haul trips? I think I was with you, wasn't I? What happened there? Please tell me.
Elk's incredulous story. Very well, says Elk. I'll tell you. Where to begin, though? I was driving my large truck at night, as I thought I'd make better progress when the roads were less busy. I had an order to deliver, and an irate customer at the other end of the line complaining bitterly that the order should have been delivered a week prior. He was never an agreeable client at the best of times, and most of the truckers had bad experiences with him. So nobody wanted to make that delivery, but in the end I agreed to do it. More's the fool me. You had come with me on this trip instead of staying at your grandmother's house. You were lying fast asleep on the passenger side seat with your teddy bear in your arms, and our cat Missy, who travelled with us wherever we went. Do you remember you were the one that found little Missy? I think you were 8 years old at the time. We had made a truck stop, a year earlier I think it was, at a gas station, and you had gone to the ladies and returned with this frightened little kitten in your arms. You had found it lying curled up to a dead kitten by the dumpster. You came up to me, your eyes brimming with tears. "Daddy, look what I found," you said. You were so sad about the kitten, because it was barely alive, your eyes round and pleading. So I couldn't resist you. I promised that we'd keep the kitten for a couple of days. We would nurse it better, then take it to a shelter. We did take it to a vet for some meds. He told us the kitten would have died if we hadn't rescued it. By day 2, that kitten was purring and eating well, and seemed to enjoy the truck, so we kept him for a little longer, and then we couldn't part with her. The rest is history, of course. I think we must have had that cat for over 20 years. It was a good innings for a cat, I have to say. It never had a sick day in its life after that, until the day it didn't wake up. Best way to go if you ask me. In your sleep.
I remember, said Sonia happily. Missy was the best trucker cat ever. She was so affectionate and she enjoyed travelling. She would jump out of the truck when we stopped off at various destinations to do her business. She'd return to the truck like clockwork. She always came to us when you whistled like a dog. It was incredible. Elk removes the large Cuban cigar from his cellophane packaging and lights it up, popping it into his mouth and blowing out a big puff of smoke. Sonia loved to watch the smoke billowing out of his mouth in a long white stream and rather enjoyed the aromatic smell. Her father always told her that smoking tobacco rarely relaxed him.
I can't believe I'm smoking a cigar. And look at it, 5 o'clock in the morning. There's a first time for everything, I guess. Well, I remember I was a little nervous about seeing Mr. Pickling. The last time I'd made a huge delivery to him, he jumped down my throat, screaming all kinds of obscenities at me. I was in the front line of his abuse every time I saw him, even though I wasn't the guilty party. It was the supplier at the other end that was at fault, that held up the deliveries. I was wondering what kind of reception I would be receiving the following morning. I was driving steadily through the night. I was drinking copious amounts of coffee along my route to stay awake. I had to pull over to answer a call of nature, and I was never one of those truckers that was happy to pee in a bottle, unless, of course, it was highly necessary, but especially not in front of a young girl like you, even if you were fast asleep. I climbed out of my truck and moved over the guardrail, down a slightly hilly embankment, towards a gathering of trees. It was a quintessential opportunity for me to stretch my legs. I hated sitting in one position for far too long. It would give me the most dreadful cramps, and especially the area between my shoulder blades would get stiff and tight. For me, stopping for a pee was this opportunity to do some jumping jacks and a few light stretches. I told you I'd be a couple of minutes and asked you if you wanted to relieve yourself as well, but you said no, so I locked you in the truck. Missy didn't hesitate to follow me out of the truck. She always enjoyed an opportunity to stretch her legs as well. I dashed towards an oak tree to relieve myself. I could smell pine from the pine forests, as well as wild flowers and moss infusing the air, with their very pleasing bouquets. The night was filled with the sounds of crickets and frogs, and the moonlight was quite bright on this evening. It was a fabulously beautiful night. I do remember that. I did my business and a few jumping jacks, but when I whistled for Missy, she didn't come at once. So I scanned the meadow for any signs of her, with my flashlight. And then there she was by a tree, looking at a great big huge lump lying on the ground, what looked like an undulating hill of some kind. But whatever it was, she wasn't impressed by it. Her tail was thrashing wildly, and she was paying absolutely no attention to my calls and my whistles, but staring at this thing. When I wandered over to her side, Missy was making a growling sound at the back of her throat, her eyes fixed on what I had first thought was a little hillock of some kind, but as I moved closer, I realized it was a dead bear lying on the ground in a fetal position. I was certainly sure it was dead, so I tapped it with the end of my boot, just to make absolutely sure. God only knows why I did this. I think it was a knee-jerk reaction of mine to check if the huge bundle of hair lying there was dead or not. This thing suddenly moved, gave me the shock of my life. It sat up, then raised itself onto its feet. I felt like David standing before Goliath, as this creature was enormous. I knew at once it was a Bigfoot. I was terrified. The thing was standing yards away from me, and the moonlight lit the creature up so brightly. Missy was hissing at it, jumping on my shoulders, her ears back, her eyes terrified. The Bigfoot actually rubbed his eyes, as if he thought I might be part of a strange dream he was having. I stood there gawking at him. I don't know who was more bewildered, me or the Bigfoot. Neither of us had anticipated such an unlikely encounter. I wanted to run with every part of my being, but I couldn't do it. It was like I was frozen to the spot. My heart began thundering in my chest. My mind was screaming, "Run! For goodness sake, run!" But the Bigfoot stood there. He scratched his head. His eyes locked into mine. And in that moment, I knew he was never going to hurt me. I saw his eyes were emotionally intelligent. He looked clever and kind even. His face was remarkably human. He was about 9 foot tall, exceedingly burly, with powerful muscles. I remember I naturally spoke to him, because it seemed like the most natural thing for me to do. So I apologized to him. I said, "I'm very sorry. I didn't mean to wake you up." I think his humanness meant it felt natural for me to talk to him like that. He looked at me and nodded. I heard the words in my head. "I certainly didn't expect to see you either." He then gave me a nod and glided into the trees, and he was gone like that. That was the momentous moment for me, when not only did I realize that Bigfoot was real, but the creature had spoken to me, which is why I believe that Bigfoot spoke to you tonight.
Why do you think he was lying there? Asked Sonia.
I'm not sure. He was probably taking a kip under the stars. I can't actually blame him. It was a magnificent night. I'd have done the same if I wasn't driving that truck. I think we really surprised him walking over to him like that. He didn't hear Missy, though. He was so sound asleep. It was Missy who first encountered him, not me. That cat never did miss a trick, did she? Sharp as a razor she was. Listen to that. I hear a truck moving towards my cabin. I suspect we have a visitor. Now, why am I not surprised? I suspected as much. I bet I know who it is, he said, smiling at Sonia. I'll make myself scarce. You have a lot of talking to do, I can see.
Sonia did hear the truck rolling up outside the cabin, and the engine switching off. Moments later the cabin door was flung open, as Luton stood there in the doorway. Sonia wanted to run over to him, throw herself into his arms. She was so pleased to see him. But then she reminded herself that Jocelyn had informed her that he had groped her, so the anger began to rise up in her belly again. She stood her ground like a lofty tree in the woodgrove, waiting to see what her husband had to say. "Thank God you're all right," said her husband, rushing up to Sonia, throwing his arms around her. "There was a multiple pile-up on one of the mountain roads. 3 people dead, 7 seriously injured. I don't to God know what I would have done if anything happened to you and the kids." We're fine, absolutely fine." "What the hell is going on?" says Luton. "I knew I would find you here at your father's cabin. I got your very peculiar message. What has Jocelyn been feeding you?" "She told me you groped her and tried to kiss her. I mean, how could you do this to me, Luton? To our children, to our marriage? I hope she was worth it." Luton frowned. "You believe our nanny over me? That's rich, Sonia. Do you really have so little faith in our marriage? Even if I was that way inclined, which I'm not, I would be incredibly stupid to have a grope with a nanny under our roof, risk losing you and the kids. But you know me. Surely you know me better than that. I'd never cheat on you. I haven't got it in me. I've got way too much to lose, and I love you far too much to hurt even a tiny hair on your little head. But then why would Jocelyn make all this stuff up? I don't understand." "Well, later in the afternoon she came up to me in the backyard. I hasten to say she was the one that tried to kiss me, not the other way round." "She what?" "She tried to kiss me. I told her she was young enough to be my daughter, and while she was a very attractive young girl, that I was a happily married man who was almost twice her age. She burst into tears, stormed off belligerently. She was most upset with me, but I thought she would get over it. I've always known she's had a bit of a crush on me." Jocelyn was standing in the doorway. "Is this true, Jocelyn? Did you try and kiss my husband? Did you make everything up?" Jocelyn hung her head in shame. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Asher. I don't know what I was thinking. Your husband's telling you the truth. He did nothing wrong. I tried to kiss him, but I promise I won't ever do it again. I promise." To cut a long story short, Mrs. Asher forgave Jocelyn and the young girl continued to work for the family. But she knew a line had been drawn in the sand, so she never flirted with Sonia's husband again. Sonia could have sacked the young girl, but she thought better of it, deciding that we all can make screw-ups from time to time. So she gave Jocelyn a second chance and never regretted it. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.